The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 551. My stupid brother. What do you think of this matter, my poor brother? I'm lying on the table watching my stupid brother. Do you know what Montenegro means to us, my poor brother? Land is land. How can it be the ocean, my stupid brother? Haven't you heard those ministers saying how barren the land of Montenegro is and how barbaric the people are? It is a completely useless piece of land for the Austrian Empire, my poor brother. Are we so useless that our father has abandoned us? The final decision of the Austrian Empire was to take over Montenegro, and Ferdinand I was crowned Grand Duke of Montenegro. Although the Regent Council had objections to this, they had no intention of disobeying the Emperor's order. What needs to be done now is to better integrate it into the Austrian Empire. Franz could only lament that people are not as good as God. At the same time, he was also reviewing whether he had really been brainwashed by the political theory of doing whatever it takes to serve the national interest. There are actually three ready-made solutions for Montenegro. First, rule without governing. Similar to the Principality of Liege, the Austrian Empire appointed officials, and there were also local parliaments. Both parties shared the same monarch to govern the country. Because Metternich forcefully promoted the Austrian model in the Principality of Liege, Franz's previous ideas came to nothing and aroused opposition from elites such as local nobles and businessmen. This was supported entirely by Austria's prestige and the locals' dislike of the French. Second, vacate the cage for birds and divide and rule, dividing the local people into different categories and sending them to different areas like Bosnia. Then use the railway to transport the Montenegrins to the plains of Vojvodina, which is easy to manage and can effectively prevent rebellion. Third, colonization is what Austria has done historically. The result, of course, is to encourage local separatist forces and make them worse. Franz does not intend to adopt the above three methods. It is a good idea to trade dragons for birds. As long as the Montenegrins are willing to leave their homeland, Franz does not mind providing them with a land with rich water and grass for them to farm and graze. But without the Montenegrins, will the Montenegrin bandits disappear? And when the bandits in Montenegro arrive on the plains, are they no longer bandits? Not necessarily. The fundamental reason for the emergence of black bandits is the contradiction between man and land and the lack of the country's basic ecological niche. Yes, Montenegrins need Montenegrin thieves. They cannot survive without robbing them. The government is weak and cannot effectively control the grassroots. The interests are intertwined. The common interests allow the local people to provide the soil for the survival of the separatist regime. Treat guests, behead him, and treat him like a dog. This trick of Huang Silong is good and will indeed produce immediate results, but the trick is just a trick after all. As the prince of a country, Franz can definitely use a more thorough method to reduce future troubles. What Franz is more worried about is whether the Croatians will conflict with the Montenegrins, a brotherly nation that speaks the same language. After all, the civil war between the Illyrians in history left a deep impression on Franz. Of course, Franz still needs to observe and analyze how to solve the Montenegrin problem. If the two ethnic groups get along harmoniously, wouldn't it save a lot of effort? Naturally, they still have to show enough sincerity and strength in the early stage. The Montenegrins can also enjoy the same treatment as the West Bosniaks, but they must accept the rule of the Austrian Empire. Franz planned to let Colonel Gablenz, although he had served as a commander many times and even commanded battles involving tens of thousands of people, but his military title should actually be that of colonel, as the military attaché stationed in Montenegro. Due to the special circumstances in Montenegro, Franz suggested that the Jejas from Tyrol or Zagreb should serve as security guards, mainly because these hunters come from mountainous areas and are better at mountain warfare. Count Latta didn't have any objections. He originally planned to send grenadiers from the Italian area. After all, the Montenegrin bandits were said to be very powerful. Although everyone now thinks that the Italian army is very crotchless, in fact, Italian soldiers were once considered the benchmark of European armies. The grenadiers here are not real grenadiers, but another title for elite troops. But the grenadier unit has not completely disappeared in this era, and most countries still have this organization. However, the hunters in Tyrol and Zagreb were not easy to mess with. As for Colonel Gabrens, Count Latter seriously suspected that this man bribed Archduke Franz. In fact, the reason why Franz valued this person so much was because he had no choice but to choose the bigger one among the dwarfs after the older generation of generals in the Austrian Empire withered away. They were completely supported by Archduke Albrecht alone. Gabrens was talented and courageous, but his promotion was too slow, and he only played an insignificant role in the Austro-Prussian War. His troops performed well, but they could not turn the tide of the war, and his proposal was only discovered after the war was over. Gabrens discovered a huge loophole in the Prussian army's tactics. He proposed a radical offensive strategy to break through the Prussian army's encirclement from the center, and then attack its left wing with all its strength, and wait for reinforcement to arrive. In theory, his tactics were feasible, and Moltke did make the mistake of leaving the center empty of troops. However, historically, it was not until after the surrender of the Austrian Empire that the secretary discovered this suggestion among the numerous battlefield documents. However, no one knows whether this advice is useful, but Gabrens's courage has been tested by history. As a senior commander, he fought hand to hand with the enemy in close combat. He was blinded in one eye and could still continue to fight. He only fainted when the troops were completely out of the battle. Franz felt that this kind of person deserved a chance to prove himself. After all, historically, this person died of drunkenness after the end of the Austro-Prussian War. Gabrens was very satisfied with this appointment. It would be better to say that he liked this life very much. At least it was much better than living in the Vienna City Defense Army and waiting to die. This is not the first time that the Jejas from Zagreb and Tyrol have cooperated. They have cooperated before in Serbia, Egypt, West Africa, and West Bosnia. They were completely dissatisfied with the Montenegro army, especially for the veterans who participated in the recapture of Belgrade. They think that the number one mercenary in Europe and the strongest mountain people is a complete joke. After all, when the Montenegrin mercenaries faced the Austrian regular army, they were no different from the Serbs who cried for their fathers and mothers. The senior official sent to Montenegro by the Austrian Imperial government was Franz Bruck, Baron Bruck's nephew. At that time, there were many people named Franz in Austria. However, this man did not take advantage of his uncle. On the contrary, being related to Baron Bruck was really unlucky. For 8 lifetimes as a model of loyal minister in ancient times, Baron Bruck reported all possible bribes to him with real names. Therefore, the career of young people in the Bruck family will be extremely difficult, and of course those who can get out of it will definitely be outstanding. Chapter 552 Loyalty to the Emperor and Patriotism. Baron Bruck was definitely an anomaly in the officialdom of the Austrian Empire. Of course, it was precisely because of the existence of this anomaly that France could save a lot of administrative costs. However, although this man is a pillar of the U state, the U family can be said to be unlucky. Baron Bruck offended many people because of his unsociable nature. Although Austria is not as wild as California, there are many things that secretly stumble the president of the Imperial Central Bank and the financial advisor to the royal family. Some people are upright and not afraid of slanting shadows, but most of his relatives are just mortals. So gods fight and mortals suffer. The lives of other members of the Bruck family are as difficult as those of workers in British factories. After all, if someone keeps an eye on you and holds you to the highest standards, life will be worse than death. Bruck was cruel to his family and even more demanding to himself. Historically, he died because he proved his innocence. Franz did not want the tragedy of history to repeat itself, so he built a mansion for the president of the Reich Central Bank opposite the central bank. At least Mr. Baron can move out of the attic where he has lived for decades. In the imperial capital where land is at a premium, Mr. Baron's salary is indeed not enough. This is a problem left over from history. Because of the large number of civil servants in the Austrian Empire and financial problems, salaries have always been very low. However, the empire had a tradition of extravagance and waste, and there were many social events in society, which in turn encouraged corruption. However, due to Franz's strong advocacy, the wages of civil servants in the Austrian Empire have been increased many times. At least they can support the whole family, and there is still some money left for less extravagant consumption. But this has also led to many problems, such as it is more difficult to obtain civil service qualifications, and more people want to take advantage of the country's loopholes to get paid. This is also an important reason why Prince Metternich opposed a salary increase for the Austrian civil service group. But Count Korolov supported a salary increase because the latter felt that the harm of those moths would be greater if they did not increase their salaries. In addition to the mansion and bodyguards, Franz also provided each member of Baron Bruck's family with an annuity as a reward for their loyal service to the royal family over the years. Although the amount is not large, it is enough for them to live a relatively decent life in the countryside. Corruption, bribery, and abuse of power were so common in the 19th century that many of them were open or semi-open. Franz was well aware of all this, but he could not act too hastily. Some diseases are not formed in a day, and naturally it is difficult to get rid of them all in one day. Moreover, if the medicine is used incorrectly, it may be counterproductive. While curing the disease, it is also necessary to strengthen the body. Otherwise, if a strong dose of medicine is taken, the person may die along with the disease. Therefore, both strengthening the body and dispelling evil are indispensable. When it comes to strengthening education, we have to mention the education in the Austrian Empire. The pilot education has achieved initial results, and a large number of missionary schools have been established with the support of the state. However, these schools were mainly built in Lusitania and the royal domain, because Franz did not know what direction the world would develop in 1848, and whether madness would devour humanity. In order to avoid the occurrence of some human tragedies, Franz decided to postpone the universal education he cherished. As for the royal territories, Franz is still very confident. He has cultivated the most basic organizational structure in these places. Even if there is a war, these people can unite to defend their property. In fact, they just use some unemployed college students who meet the standards, plus a group of loyal retired officers. These people are usually considered a relatively useless group of people in Austrian society, but they are just right for the grassroots. In fact, in addition to them, there are countless churches and priests acting as lubricants. Don't underestimate the role of this group of magicians. They play an indispensable role in the lives of the people at the bottom at this time. In this era, many people never left their villages or fields. They were baptized by clergy when they were born, and their subsequent weddings and funerals were presided over by priests. Especially the parish priests in some small places are as authoritative as the patriarchs of ancestral halls in the south. The skeleton formed by these people staying together, coupled with the people who have completed the education of loyalty to the emperor and patriotism, can form an indestructible fortress. In addition to literacy, basic education in Austria aims to improve people's obedience to the country, which is the so-called loyalty to the emperor and patriotism. This is nothing new. Prussia had already started patriotic education as early as William III. Its main purpose was to improve the quality of its citizens and build national consciousness. After all, the Germans at that time did not have a strong concept of a country. For example, the Austrian army often included Hessians, Bavarians, Saxons, and even Hanoverians. When the German states were fighting, everyone would join the army of whichever country they liked. For example, General Julius Jacob von Hainaut was actually a Hessian, while Field Marshal of Saxony was a Württemberg. King Friedrich William III of Prussia decided to end this chaos. On the advice of the great educator Humboldt, he began to declare war on tradition and ask the people to be loyal to the country and respect the monarch. Therefore, the Prussians rarely fought for other countries' war. Looking back at history, the Austrians did this very poorly, and even a guy who practiced Tathagata's reverse palm was misunderstood as a German. Many Prussian practices have been passed down to modern times, such as flag-raising ceremonies, singing the national anthem, and promoting the country's history. especially the victory in the war against Austria. In addition, the Prussian government also established the Prussian Youth Army in various schools, aiming to cultivate discipline and patriotism in young students through military training. Prussia's loyal and patriotic education achieved great success in Prussia, improving national consciousness and citizen quality, and laying a solid foundation for Prussia's rise in Europe. This education system was later imitated and introduced by other countries. Historically, the Austrians also learned it, but they failed to understand it, and instead caused a lot of complaints. In fact, the situation in the Austrian Empire was much more complicated than that of Prussia. The former had many ethnic groups, and mountains and rivers divided it into geographical units. At least the word nationalism should not be used casually. The only thing holding the country together was the royal family and the church, but Franz would find a way to integrate it into a unified economy. After all, as history develops, the first two ties will become increasingly fragile, while the economic chain will become increasingly tight. Of course, strength is only relative. If Franz can become a great man from heaven, turn the tide and complete the great cause of resurgence, then the bond of the royal family will become the reins of the entire country and completely control the direction of the empire. The concept of loyalty to the emperor and patriotism had actually been played by the Prussians, so clearly that Franz couldn't even think of anything to add. The only thing that can be learned seems to be the backward approach of combining secular imperial power with divine power. Although this approach can attract a large number of fanatical supporters, it will also bring a lot of unnecessary trouble to itself. And Franz is not sure whether he will also be lost in the wave of personality worship. After all, there are many strong men with iron will and visionary geniuses in history, but they cannot escape the fate of being praised in the end. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 553. Fremont voted. What could $5 million buy in the 19th century? On October 27, 1821, the United States and Spain signed a contract to purchase the ownership of Florida for $5 million. In fact, the Americans did not spend a penny, but directly occupied it militarily in the name of expelling the Indians through the Seminole War. Spain, which was declining, had no strength to bargain with this emerging power in North America. In addition, the former had constant domestic uprisings and natural disasters, so it could only give Florida to the latter for nothing. Adams, the then US Secretary of State, said excitedly, "This will be a new era in American history," but he never imagined that 23 years later, the Austrians would buy a fleet of 70 warships and 18,000 officers and soldiers from the Americans for $5 million. In fact, before Ashton Hoffman, the emissary of the Austrian-Mexican Joint Development Company, arrived, the US military was divided into two camps. One group advocated directly admitting defeat and withdrawing to the United States, while the other group advocated continuing to fight to contain the Austrian army. However, because of John Fremont's personal reputation and excellent organizational skills, these people were united to continue harassing the California coastline, making it impossible for the Austrian army to expand further, even if at one point. But since that meeting, John Fremont has been trying his best to cover up the fact that he has lost contact with the mainland United States. However, paper cannot cover fire, and forcibly putting paper on a fire will encourage the spread of fire. In order to dispel the doubts of the soldiers, John Fremont directed and acted in a big play. His men hired a group of businessmen from the port of Barranquilla in Colombia to act as messengers and then read the good news to the soldiers of the expeditionary force. It did boost the morale of the soldiers at that time, but some people raised objections as to why the US military had already breached Fortress San Gabriel in Mexico City and did not continue to send troops to attack Los Angeles and San Francisco. And why are there no reinforcement, even a little supply? But those were just the voices of the minority, and all it took at this point was a big whim for John Fremont to regain control of the situation. But reality hit him hard again. I don't know where the Austrians got so many troops, and there were guards in every city. It is simply a joke. to let the Navy go to land to forcibly attack well-defended positions after several defeats in a row. John Fremont had to lead his army back to the temporary camp to wait for the opportunity. However, it rained continuously all night, and the fleet's supplies were at the bottom point. In fact, he had previously relied on plundering the coastal areas of California, but now that this method didn't work, he could only go to the nearest port for supplies. The closest place to here is the port of Barranquilla in Gran Colombia, but now John Fremont is facing a new problem, that is, no money. Point at the same time, John Fremont was not the real commander of this fleet, and he had no authority to owe debts on behalf of the United States. The Colombians also brought a lot of bad news to the US military. Point that is, the European powers had decided to support Mexico. The fleets of Britain, France, and Austria have set off from the European continent. What's more terrible is that Winfield's army has been surrounded by the Mexicans, and Zachary Taylor's main force still has not broken through Rand River line of defense. Point John Fremont wanted to call these rumors, but another soldier met the extras he had hired before in the tavern. Point after a cordial and friendly exchange with him, the American soldier learned the truth of the matter. The development of the matter had exceeded the control of John Fremont. Point the angry crowd locked John Fremont into the cargo warehouse on the flagship. He did not resist, and did not want to resist again. Point in the warehouse, John Fremont began to worry about the future fate of the United States, because his strange army seemed to have become a lone force at this time. An inexplicable sadness came to his heart, and he even began to doubt that he would soon will die in his sleep. Point, but when John Fremont woke up the next day, he was not dead. On the contrary, the door of the warehouse was opened, and someone asked him to get out. Point John Fremont was very calm at this time, just smiled and tidied his clothes. Is there any cigarette? The soldier on the side quickly took out a cigarette from his pocket and handed it over. John Fremont held the cigarette in his mouth and continued, "Is there a fire?" The soldier quickly took out another match, and with a crisp sound, the smell of burning red phosphorus and pine wood came out. John Fremont took a deep breath and closed his eyes, as if he was reminiscing about something. "Thank you. Please lead the way," John Fremont said sincerely. Point soon the hatch cover was opened, and the long-lost sunshine made the explorer squint his eyes, and he began to think about his life and those thrilling adventures. John Fremont looked at these familiar faces in front of him. He felt a little guilty, but he had no regrets. If God gave him another chance, John Fremont would still choose to cross the Rocky Mountains and the Nevada desert to this golden coast. Point breathing the slightly salty sea breeze, John Fremont felt that today was indeed a good day to die, so he walked to the bow of the ship. "Come on, let's get started. Long live freedom. Long live democracy." Beauty. John Fremont was interrupted before he could finish his last words. The officers on the side helped him put on the uniform of a naval admiral and the sailing cap that symbolized the commander of the fleet. Point the captains shouted in unison, "Mr. Fremont, you are now our fleet commander." In fact, after John Fremont was imprisoned in the warehouse, the US military had a firefight on the land of Gran Colombia, and nearly 1,000 people died before it calmed down. Point John Fremont is not an idiot. He knows very well that, if his approach does not satisfy everyone, the final result is likely to be like the group of people who were purged last night, dying in a foreign country. Long live the Austrian Empire. We have turned from darkness to light. Long live, accompanied by cheers and flying navy hats. Fremont's fleet sailed towards Los Angeles. As for the account at the port of Barranquilla, it was naturally recorded with the OMA United Development Company. Point in fact, every move of the US military is under Austrian surveillance, but if Fremont can persist for a while, he may be able to wait for intelligence from Washington. Point, because this time John Taylor sent a warship to deliver information, which was not something that hundreds of Austrian agents could solve. Point there is no problem for these intelligence officers to deal with couriers or ordinary businessmen, but there is almost no chance of winning against the army. After all, the training they receive is mainly to collect and transmit intelligence, not to fight. Point but unfortunately, by the time Washington's messenger discovered Fremont's fleet, the latter had already flown the Austrian flag, and chose to sink the former without hesitation. Point it would have been better if Franz had put the messenger back in Washington, as he must have preferred the California Coast Patrol. Chapter 554 Another failure. The tug-of-war on the Rio Grande continued. Zachary Taylor withdrew more than a dozen brigade commanders in succession, but the siege still showed no improvement. In desperation, he had no choice but to use his trump card, a reward of $10,000 for tips on breaking the city. Then the US military staged various suicidal charges under the city of Albuquerque, and the US troops all over the mountains and plains launched a storming attack on this last fortress in northern Mexico. The artillery has been ringing non-stop since early morning, which is as oppressive as a death knell. Soon the gaps in the wall became larger and larger. The defenders had finished shooting their shotguns long ago. They could only collect iron nails and broken pieces of iron and put them into the barrel. However, they still had no problem killing enemies close at hand under the huge barrel pressure. Loading, aiming, shooting, cleaning the barrel, and reloading. Every soldier is mechanically repeating the same actions, and these actions have long been ingrained in their bones. It can be said that they are the most skilled in the tactics of the entire Mexican army, because they know nothing but fighting and killing. This is their life skill. Although Diego was a general, he had given up command at this time and picked up his rifle to join the battle. He just kept roaring like a wild beast, and the other black soldiers and the mixed race white people who were treated as abandoned sons were also roaring, as if they wanted to pour all their anger on the enemy. At that time, it was not the Indians who had the lowest social status in Mexico, but the mixed race whites who were looked down upon by both groups at the same time. This time, in addition to ladders, the US military also brought many sandbags. These sandbags and corpses soon piled up a gentle slope under the city wall. Soon the ladder was filled with people. Some Mexican soldiers wanted to push the ladder down, but they couldn't move it even with all their strength. Instead, they were unfortunately hit by the enemy soldiers below and fell off the tower. In fact, the ladder is much heavier than people think, usually more than 100 kilograms. Adding the weight of a person may weigh 1,000 kilograms. Even a strong man cannot push it down for a while, unless a special city guard is used. Equipment, which the Mexicans apparently don't have. At first, the gentle slope at the gap in the city wall was a bit steep, but as the number of corpses and sandbags continued to increase, it became increasingly gentle and suitable for attack. The Mexicans defending the city were not fools. They aimed their last few cannons at the gap to cover the gap. But even so, they could not stop the large-scale charge of the US military, and they were still attacked by the opponent. Zachary Taylor saw the soldiers had scaled the walls and opened a bottle of champagne. Gentlemen, today, we are here to raise a toast together to pay tribute to the victory of the United States. May this powerful and brave country remain invincible and invincible. May the people of the United States have a bright future and a peaceful and prosperous life. Let us work hard for America's future together. Here's to the great America. To the future president. In fact, some of his subordinates had already guessed Zachary Taylor's thoughts. Otherwise no boss would have said such a formal toast. Zachary Taylor smiled and said nothing, but that smile said it all. However, the bloody battle at the top of the city has just begun. In fact, at all times, and in all countries, except for the Japanese, few armies would eject bullets from the chamber when bayoneting. On the contrary, the famous Russian general believed that soldiers who did not leave a bullet before bayoneting were stupid pigs. Therefore, some black soldiers tried to take advantage of their physical strength and use cold weapons to defeat the crowd of American soldiers who rushed in. This was a miscalculation. However, after the only bullet was fired, the weakness of the US military became apparent. Many people did not know how to fight with bayonets, or did not carry bayonets. They could only temporarily turn the gun upside down and use the but to hit each other. At this time, they arrived at the home court of the Black Army. Diego and his guards almost all had 2 revolvers each. Revolvers are very useful in this kind of close quarters hand-to-hand combat. The US military does not have such advanced weapons except for officers, and it is impossible for those officers to lead the charge. Diego was not in a hurry to empty the bullets. In addition to 2 new revolvers, he also had a custom-made steel knife from the Austrian Empire, which weighed more than 6 kilograms. 6 kilograms does not sound very heavy, but in fact, the weight of an officer's sword in this era usually did not exceed 1.5 kilograms, and the weight of an ordinary samurai sword Fighting sword did not exceed 1.2 kilograms, but for a muscular man who is over 210 centimeters tall and can strangle a puma with his arms, a 6-kilogram knife is just right. With the sword in hand, Digo slashed an American soldier in two with his gun diagonally. The splattering blood and the enemy's cries of fear stimulated this humanoid Gundam to kill even more crazily. As soon as an American soldier climbed up the city wall, his arm was cut off with a knife, and his head was hit with another knife. The splattered blood gave the other soldiers waiting for the city a bloody blow, and the fallen body killed another unlucky guy. Smashed to the ground. Soon the first batch of American soldiers in the city were slaughtered, but the officers did not want to give up and immediately led the supervising team to drive back the siege troops. The US military once again rushed towards the gap in the city wall. This time the Mexican army defending the city rolled the powder barrel directly down the slope, knocking down several US soldiers who were unable to dodge on the way. At this time, the officer supervising the battle under the city discovered the powder keg. It's a powder keg. Then there was only a boom, and a large number of American soldiers were blown up to the west. Then more barrels rolled out, and the officers and the supervisory team fled back to their own positions as if lifeless. Naturally, the ordinary soldiers of the US Army were not to be outdone and joined the running team. In fact, among the barrels thrown out by the Mexican army later, only a few were explosive barrels filled with gunpowder, and the vast majority were empty beer barrels. However, the US military's massive attack was repelled anyway. Zachary Taylor saw the US troops on the front line being defeated like an ebbing tide, and he was so angry that he threw the cup again. If we fall like this again, we will have to blow on the bottle. That would be ungentlemanly, a staff officer complained in a low voice. Fortress Albuquerque is finished. Those Mexicans are about to collapse. Hurry up and let them gather their troops and charge again. Zachary Taylor roared hysterically, but the officers in the command post took no action. Because everyone knows that, although the Black Legions in the city suffered heavy losses, the US military who failed to siege the city paid a greater price. Moreover, if you want to gather the defeated troops in a short period of time, it is impossible to organize another siege point, because these US troops actually belong to different legions. Many soldiers only know their brigade commanders or even regimental commanders. The only people who can mobilize them are the commanders of the units directly under them. In addition, the US military also has a large number of militiamen and local troops. Their organization is so chaotic that the officers who sent them can't explain clearly. In this way, Zachary Taylor had to swallow the bitter fruit of failed siege again. At the same time, a huge army was approaching the Rio Grande barracks. Chapter 555 Strange Soldiers. Under the scorching sun, above the endless wilderness, a small group of US reconnaissance cavalry saw a shade of trees in the distance. They decided to go to the shade, to rest for a while. After all, in most people's minds, Zachary Taylor's order to find the main force of the Mexican army here was a complete joke. If hundreds of thousands of people were wandering on the Great Plains, they would have been discovered long ago. But as soon as they dismounted and were about to rest against a tree, they were ambushed by the Mexicans. The battle ended in an instant. 3 of the 6-person reconnaissance team died on the spot and 3 were captured. On the hillside not far away, Jimmy was observing everything happening here with a telescope. He couldn't understand why the US military would expand its reconnaissance scope so much. Could it be that he knew the Mexican army's strategic deployment in advance? But this is unlikely. After Miss Jenny's incident, Tazanana has become extremely cautious. Only people at the general level can know the entire plan. Even Jimmy's adjutant thought that he was going north to eliminate the rebels. In fact, Jimmy's order was to go north to Juarez to join Digo's legion and eliminate the rebels. However, when he arrived in Juarez, he discovered that Digo's legion was trapped in Albuquerque. This is an unreasonable thing, because in order to attack the Albuquerque fortress, the US military must cross the Rio Grande, and Digo had enough time to lead his men to escape. When the opponent crossed the river, there are only 2 possibilities for the current situation. Either Digo is too confident, or the US military is too reckless. But no matter what the situation is, Jimmy must find a way to help. Because Albuquerque is the last barrier in northern Mexico. Once it is lost, half of the country will be lost to the enemy, and it will be difficult to regain it. After succeeding, the scouts waved to the hillside where Jimmy was. If they raised their perspective over the hillside, they would see an entire cavalry division of 7,000 cavalry resting with their horses. Jimmy didn't know the news of the defeat of Veracruz at this time. He felt that Tazanana's troops would arrive as soon as possible after solving Winfield, so his task was to hold back the US military and wait for the arrival of reinforcement. Early the next morning, the bugle sounded, and the American soldiers gathered together with their tired bodies. Before the war even started, some people broke down and cried non-stop. They didn't shut up until they were whipped to greet them. Zachary Taylor once again appeared in front of the army and once again began his speech. I am here today to tell you that we are about to face a great challenge, a war that could cause great harm to our country, our nation and our people. The enemy we have to face is powerful and cruel, but we have defeated many powerful enemies in history, whether they are savage Indians, tyrannical Spaniards, or cunning British. They were all defeated by the great at the feet of America. Now I call upon you to join this glorious fight in pursuit of honor, victory, and the defense of liberty. Let us make the best choices for ourselves, for our families, for our community, and for future Americans. Thank you for your support. I have to say that Zachary Taylor's speech level is not bad, but too many defeats make it difficult for the US military at this time to believe that victory is possible. Moreover, there is an even more outrageous rumor in the military camp. That is, it is not the curse of the Indians that causes widespread death of the US military, but the Black Death. This terrible disease will cause the body to turn black after death, and eventually turn into a black man. Then they will get out of their graves in the middle of the night and join the enemy camp. So the enemies in the Albuquerque fortress will always. It's impossible to kill them all. Although this rumor was very outrageous, it was widely circulated among the military. There was even a rumor that General Stephen Kearny, who was attacking California, also encountered a demon. It is said that the expedition fleet encountered the Austrians and summoned the Kraken. The legendary Kraken, which was devoured. Tazanana himself is a black magician who can teleport hundreds of thousands of troops from Albuquerque to Veracruz in an instant, and God knows if he will teleport them back again. There was a lot of uneasiness and fear among American soldiers. Zachary Taylor's speech did nothing to dispel these negative emotions, but the war must continue. On the top of the city, Diego put a leaf into his mouth and chewed it repeatedly. The bitter leaf juice lifted his spirits. The US military also attempted several sneak attacks last night, which exhausted the defenders at this time. In fact, under Sherman's suggestion, the US military's night attack tactics were very successful, but these people discovered a problem. After reaching the top of the city. Most US troops have night blindness, and black people are almost invincible in the dark. On the other hand, under the care of Tazanana, the Black Army almost eliminated this disease. In fact, when the main force of the Mexican army left, they left behind a large amount of supplies, so much that the defenders could not eat them all. This night attack also caused the future master of terror in the Civil War to suffer from phobia of the dark. He did not have night blindness, so he could see clearly how the black people killed his comrades. Sherman hid in the pile of corpses and was finally kicked off the city wall and rolled down the slope to the ground before escaping. He became the only survivor of his company. But it has to be said that Sherman's tactics were actually very successful. If it had been repeated a few more times, the defenders would have collapsed. The battle began again, and the American troops roared towards the dilapidated fortress. Diego and his men were ready to die, because Zachary Taylor would not allow them to surrender. In fact, even if the US military allows these black people to surrender, they may not choose to surrender. But since the other party won't give them a way to survive at this time, they don't have to make excuses for themselves, and they can just fight to the end. The US Army once again attacked the city wall, and fierce hand-to-hand combat broke out between the two sides. Corpses covered the ground. Even if the Mexican army once again used a powder keg, it could not stop the US troops from charging higher and higher. Zachary Taylor looked at the scene in front of him with satisfaction, but this time he did not choose to open the champagne, but let the military band play Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. However, as the exciting music sounded, the situation on the battlefield took a turn for the worse, and a large number of Mexican cavalry suddenly appeared on the flanks of the US military. In the 19th century, generally speaking, Cavalry directly attacking infantry lines without the cover of artillery and infantry was tantamount to seeking death point, but this was the time when the US infantry was most lax. They did not form a line, but were attacking the Albuquerque fortress in a skirmish formation point at the same time. The Mexican cavalry rushed out from the flanks, resulting in a serious shortage of US troops facing the enemy directly. At this time, some officers realized that, as long as they could quickly form a hollow square formation, they could defeat the impact of the enemy cavalry point. Once the cavalry loses its impact, it becomes a target for the infantry point. However, with the level of training and organization of the US military at that time, it was impossible to complete such a difficult tactical formation at the moment, when the enemy cavalry was charging at high speed. Chapter 556 Victory that ends abruptly. The sound of horse hooves sounded. At first, the chaos on the battlefield made people unable to pay attention to this sound, but soon the sparse sounds began to become denser, gradually overpowering the shouts of killing on the battlefield. What happened? No, it's the cavalry. Enemy. Attack. Enemy. Attack. The US red team suddenly became chaotic, and some officers knew how critical the situation was at this time. Hollow. Phalanx. Hurry. Otherwise we will all die here. Damn it, don't run. But fear is human nature, and it can easily spread. In fact, the tactics chosen by these US military officers were correct, but the Americans were too smart. They all knew that the person at the front of such a large-scale cavalry charge would most likely die, and the only way to survive was to outrun their comrades. Of course, a few people chose to fight back and fired with muskets while running. The hit rate can be imagined. However, these stray bullets still knocked some unlucky cavalry off their horses, but this did not slow down the advance of the Mexican cavalry at all. The Mexican cavalry rushed in from the side and rear of the American army like cutting through waves, and their sabers hit one neck after another with huge inertia. However, compared to the saber, self-trampling is more lethal to the US military itself. Because there are always some strong people who think that, as long as they can knock others down, they can create a way for themselves. Little do they know that a person can't run with two legs. Zachary Taylor's eyes were filled with tears when he saw this scene through the telescope. He immediately sent people to organize a team to stop the Mexican cavalry from massacring his own rear. Tell Brigadier General James and Brigadier General Nathan that they have to hold off these damn Mexicans. Yes. The messenger immediately rode away. The US troops on the front line could not see the situation behind them and were still attacking the gap in the city wall, but the defenders on the top of the city could see the chaos happening in the distance. Digo, our reinforcements are coming. Mr. President's main force is back. We won. At this time, the defenders looked into the distance. Although they didn't know what was happening, the US military's rear formation was indeed in chaos. This was like a shot in the arm, immediately re-energizing these tired warriors. Now that the reinforcement have arrived, they have nothing to hold back. All the gunpowder barrels, as well as the wine barrels containing gunpowder, were pushed out by the defenders. Explosions were heard one after another for a while. And finally the US troops in front couldn't stand it anymore and began to retreat. But when they turned around, they saw an even more terrifying scene. A group of cavalry had already reached them not far away amid the billowing smoke and dust. In fact, Brigadier General James and Brigadier General Nathan had already ordered the soldiers to stand ready before Zachary Taylor's order. However, the enemy's large number of broken troops made it impossible for them to take action. Direct shooting kills the broken troops of the US military, but if you don't shoot, those broken troops will scatter the originally tight formation. As a result, they became part of the rout and further attacked the friendly forces in the rear. Zachary Taylor looked at the chaotic battlefield and knew he had failed again. But it wasn't his fault, it was John Taylor's. If it weren't for the guy who didn't understand military affairs at all who forced him to attack, Zachary Taylor would have been able to defend the Rio Grande barracks impregnably. Retreat. The officers at the headquarters all breathed a sigh of relief. After all, they were afraid that the commander would be motivated and choose to fight with this group of Mexicans. Although the US military has an absolute advantage in terms of numbers, it is only a matter of time before they can eat them all. But God knows if Tazanana's main force is following behind. If they are attacked again, the United States will really be exhausted. After all, if the Rio Grande military camp is lost, the Colorado River transportation will be cut off, and then Stephen Carney's expeditionary force will lose supplies, and it will also become a turtle in the urn for both Mexico and Austria. Seeing that the US military retreated, Jimmy did not choose to pursue it, nor did he lead the army into the city. He just entered the city alone. Digo, damn it, you devil. Why are you here now, Jimmy? Damn it, you idiot. Why don't you leave, Digo? Stop talking about those unpleasant things. When will the president's main force come? When will we cross the river, Jimmy? Waved to the former and whispered, only, my troops are coming. I don't know when the president's main force will arrive. What? Keep your voice down, and don't let others know. Otherwise this fortress will not be able to be defended. Digo let out a sigh of relief. How many people did you bring? 7,000, maybe only 5,000 now. How many more people do you have? Digo scratched his head. There are less than 3,000 people left. The two of them had their brows knitted into knots. Then they smiled at the same time and gave each other a high five. Go have a drink, Tazan. Anna outside Veracruz received a batch of assistance from Austria, especially those heavy siege weapons and professional artillery that made the US military miserable. At the same time, bankers in New York and Washington were also pushing for a divorce. From the beginning of the US-Mexican War to the present, the US government has loaned more than $500 million, and this number is still rising. Historically, the entire US-Mexican War cost only $120 million, but due to some reliable news, bankers across the United States united. Actually not just bankers, but also factory owners, arms dealers, transportation tycoons, etc. With the combination of these people, they successfully hollowed out the US government. No matter how capable John Taylor was, he couldn't defeat this group of people. However, they were not opposed to the war, they just wanted to establish a free central bank. John Taylor knew the purpose of these people very well. In order to ensure the freedom of the United States, he must not let these guys act recklessly, but it was impossible to admit failure. Stephen Carney's expedition also seems to have failed. The United States seems to have run out of energy, but history seems irreversible. France suddenly announced that it would support the United States in the Mexican-American War. The French army quickly surrounded the Albuquerque fortress. At the same time, Jimmy and Digo in the fortress received news from Vice President Ravel. They knew there would be no more reinforcement, and the French were relatively civilized, giving the Mexicans a decent chance to leave the fort with their flags intact. So far, all of northern Mexico, except California, has fallen. On September 1, 1844, the Paris Peace Conference was held in France. Mexico admitted defeat and ceded 80% of New Mexico's territory. France received the modern states of New Mexico and Arizona, and the United States received Utah and Colorado. New Mexico at this time included the modern states of New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. The only remaining part of New Mexico is Nevada, a vast desert that stretches as far as the eye can see. Mexico received compensation of only $30 million and 50 million francs, which was the result of mediation between Austria and the United Kingdom. In fact, the reason why France suddenly changed its mind was that in addition to Louis Philippe being short-sighted and unable to resist the temptation of John Taylor, experts in Western political science also strongly supported his approach. That is to obtain relative benefits at all costs, which means that even if the interests of the country are harmed, as long as the losses of Austria's regional competitors are greater than themselves, it is reasonable. What's more, France can not only inhibit Austria's development in North America, but also obtain so much Mexican land for free. Why not do this kind of thing? That kills two birds with one stone. As for offending Austria, it is only a matter of time before the two sides compete for regional hegemony. Now it is regarded as a return gift during the Luxembourg crisis. This paragraph was added later, and is not included in the word count. France saw the Americans' successive defeats, and was afraid that Austria's power in North America would further strengthen. This was a challenge to France's regional hegemony. At the same time, they could still participate in the war at this time. Picking peaches. Not only can they see practical benefits, they can also weaken their competitors. Although the absolute benefits are small, the relative benefits are large, so the French chose to help the United States. Chapter 557 Counterattack. Fight to Paris, crush. King Yellow's head, roar, squeeze. When news of what happened in Mexico reached Austria, the citizens were very angry and demanded a declaration of war against France. The Austrians had little affection for Mexico and were not even aware that the latter was an economic colony of the empire. These people did not react at all when the Paris Peace Conference was held, although they were somewhat disgusted with the United States' silent stand, were somewhat disdainful of France for helping the evil, and were somewhat sympathetic to Mexico, the innocent victim. But these are not enough to affect the peaceful days of singing and dancing in Vienna. After all, the New World is synonymous with barbarism and ignorance. Until coffins and obituaries arrived from the sea, people were angry and surprised at Austria's loss. 4,000 people. This is arguably the largest casualty figure anyone has heard of in this generation. After all, the empire usually chooses to conceal casualty figures or even lie. That's why the number of 4,000 people has such a shocking power. In fact, if you are familiar with Austrian history, you will not be shocked. After all, the number of casualties in any defeated battle will exceed this number, and even historians may not be able to count how many defeats Austria has suffered. Moreover, these obituaries include a large number of doctors, clergy, teachers, college students, and even nobles. These people should have been away from the battlefield, but they died in the war, which made the people particularly angry. This is mainly a problem with yellow fever. The virus does not know which country you are from, or what your identity is. Although France has made a lot of preparations for these people in advance, there are still a large number of medical staff and clergy working with them. Infection through contact with patients. In fact, even Franz himself did not expect this. He thought these people would choose to stay away from the epidemic area and then find a few unlucky people to conduct research. As for teachers and college students, their fighting enthusiasm is the highest, but their fighting effectiveness is the worst. Their bravery cannot protect them from bullets, and the cruelty of war is beyond their imagination. The reason why noble gentlemen suffered such high casualties can only be said to be that Americans do not respect military ethics. The latter specializes in fighting officers. However, it is a centuries-old tradition for Austrian noble officers to be at the forefront of the team. Still can't change it. Of course, in addition to these upper-class people, there are also various professions such as bakers, shoemakers, miners, porters, tinkers, gardeners, farmers, security guards, veterans, etc. There are not many professional soldiers, which leaves room for the public's imagination. In their eyes, Austrians go to Mexico to maintain peace, conduct humanitarian relief, and work normally. But the Americans, under the command of the French, carried out a brutal massacre of innocent people in Austria and signed an agreement that would continue to harm Austrians overseas in the future. In fact, not only the people at the bottom, but also the upper class also hated the French's behavior, because this war will undoubtedly affect Austria's gains in Mexico. This would have a direct impact on the economy and their lives. After all, they knew how much Mexican silver and goods were flowing into the Austrian Empire every year. At the same time, the Austrian Empire has many veterans and veterans of the anti-French war. They are now in high positions and are indignant at the French picking Austrian peaches. Except for Austria, the German states were also agitated because 2/3 of those people were Germans. A lot of nationalists took this opportunity to jump up and down and incite anti-French sentiments, especially as atrocities against the French broke out in the 3 South German countries. Even Alsace and Lorraine, where French rule had always been very stable, had riots. The industrially developed lower class people in these 2 regions were exploited more severely than in other regions. Coupled with the current economic prosperity in the German region and the awakening of national consciousness, these Germans who originally supported France were divided. Louis Philippe did not treat it as a big deal at first, thinking that they were just rioters like Lyon. As long as they were suppressed once and for all, those people would learn to behave. But if Gizzard was still in the cabinet, he would definitely stop the crazy behavior of Louis Philippe and Salt. But at this time, he was already in Texas, and he was still immersed in the news that he had just acquired nearly 600,000 square kilometers, and the French mainland, about the same size, land of joy. Soon a French army entered Alsace-Lorraine and carried out a bloody suppression of the local thugs. Originally this was just an ordinary military operation, but as a small group of German nationalists fled into the Rhineland, the nature of the war changed. French suppressive forces pursued the remnants of the rebels, and some of the rebels crossed the Saar and Rhine rivers. When the French wanted to continue their pursuit, they were strongly blocked by the Prussian army and the Baden army. Although France is strong, it cannot arbitrarily go to war with neighboring countries, but there are still ways to disgust these villains who protect criminals. They set up an execution ground by the river, killing and violently killing women. As the saying goes, a rabbit dies and a fox grieves its own kind. Not to mention those of the same race who are connected by blood and speak the same language as them. This behavior greatly angered the Germans on the other side of the river, and finally a Prussian soldier couldn't help but shot and wounded a French soldier. Lieutenant General Jean-Baptiste Montmorency had participated in the Napoleonic Wars. In his eyes, the Germans were inherently inferior, and he had the example of Lion. This veteran general didn't care how many people were killed or how many houses were burned, but he felt that he must punish the Prussians for their provocative behavior, so he ordered someone to send a very stern letter demanding compensation for the French army's losses and deliver the German who shot at the French warrior. In fact, Lieutenant General Montmorency was also deceived by his subordinates. After all, those people would not say that they were killing the chicken to show the monkey on the other side of the river. On the other side of the river, Field Marshal Karl von Hagen received the letter, tore it into pieces, and threw it in the face of the French courier. Damn it. How can a lieutenant general be so arrogant? That damn Frenchman is dead. No one can insult Prussia anymore. However, I have to say that the French in this era were very proud and upright. The low-level officer who acted as the messenger not only did not have the slightest fear, but said with his head held high, "You shouldn't tear it up, because you are not qualified. That letter represents France's goodwill. If you and your country don't accept it, maybe we can meet again in Berlin in 18 days, scumbag." Versage, I have been fighting the French all my life. Am I still afraid of you now? Go back and tell that bastard that I will lead my troops to fight there now. Marshal Karl von Hagen. The French officer still held his chin high, which made Field Marshal Karl von Hagen even more irritated. Whoever has relatives across the river, give him 10 slaps in the mouth. Make this damn Gallic chicken proud. Thank you for your support. Chapter 558 Unexpected. Not to mention the Gallic chicken whose face was swollen. Franz, who was in Vienna, did not feel that Austria had suffered much loss after all. After Mexico was hit hard, it was no longer able to manage northern affairs, and control of Nevada fell into the hands of Austria. Although Nevada at this time was just a big desert in the eyes of France, the United States, and Mexico, it actually had gold mines that were not inferior to California. And in 1859, the world's largest silver mine was discovered. In addition, Austria received a fleet of 70 ships and nearly 50,000 young and strong laborers at the same time. Anti-French and anti-American sentiments are rising in Mexico, but it has not become as depressed as it has historically been. Nor has there been an anarchic vacuum. Rather, it is better to say that the Mexican government, which has lost New Mexico, can finally develop with peace of mind. Mexico's population is so small that only one person lives in the vast territory in the north, even more than 10 kilometers away. In fact, Mexico did not need to cede so much land, but the British backstabbing at the Paris Peace Conference made the situation extremely unfavorable to the Mexican side. France didn't understand the British's motives at first, but after the troublemakers did this, although the US-Mexican War was over, the situation in North America became more tense, and the British's purpose was naturally clear. Originally, France only planned to cede half of New Mexico so as to leave a buffer zone, but this obviously cannot satisfy the appetite of the United States. After all, they have paid too much. The opinions of Americans are not important and Austria can ignore them. But Louis Philippe himself was tempted. His reason was that Mexico was originally Spanish territory, and France sent troops to quell the rebellion. Louis Philippe's little idea was winner take all. Not only did he want the entire New Mexico, he also didn't want to leave any food for the United States. At this time, the United Kingdom suddenly changed its stance and began to support the United States. Finally, after some bargaining, France, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States formally recognized Mexico's independence in writing. The United States and France paid Mexico $30 million and 50 million francs respectively. Immediately. The OMM and the United States failed to reach an agreement on the return of prisoners. The former demanded that the latter pay a ransom of $200 million, which was naturally impossible for the latter to agree. Therefore, the OM United Development Company stated that US military prisoners of war need to work in California to redeem themselves, and then they will no longer be controlled by the former. In fact, after seeing the prosperity of California, many of these Americans chose to become Californians, and some even wrote letters to their families, asking them to enjoy the blessings together. As for those US military warships, they were naturally used to pay off debts, and the Austrian side still released some senior US military generals. However, this does not include John Fremont and a group of naval admirals. At this time, this former American hero has become a vanguard of anti-Americanism. This may be the so-called convert fanaticism. The biggest problem facing California now is that it borders the French colony, and contact with the Americans is only a matter of time. Therefore, the so-called Paris Agreement is just laying a time bomb for the future. France is not worried about this because he knows very well that civil strife will occur in France in a few years, and there will be a power vacuum by then. It was the end of French rule in North America. But what confused Franz was why the British would do this, because it would make France too powerful in North America, which was theoretically not conducive to the balance of forces among all parties, and would make the French dominate. The good news was that John Tyler's approval ratings had plummeted due to his poor performance in the Mexican-American War. And it was James Knox Polk who was about to take office, although Martin Van Buren was ostensibly more popular. But Franz knew that it was Polk who won the election in the end. The main reason why he came to power was to comply with the needs of American expansionism, abandon 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude, or go to war. Polk received support from the people for this slogan, and was elected as the 11th President of the United States. Historically, James Knox Polk left the British diplomat at the time speechless, sweating profusely, and even nearly fainted when Polk left. However, this time the British diplomat who confronted Polk was Palmerston. The first generation king just smiled and said disdainfully, "Do you want to challenge the three major powers of Britain, France, and Austria alone, or do you want to be beaten by the three major powers in a group?" Polk said angrily, "What do you mean?" Palmerston still looked at the former like an idiot and said, "See you off." Although John Tyler won the Mexican-American War, it did not satisfy the American expansionists, so Polk's slogan still had strong enough appeal. It's just that the latter himself was a little scared by Palmerston. After all, he was just strong and arrogant, but not brainless. No country in the world can withstand the joint attack of the great powers, let alone the United States, which is very difficult to face Austria alone. However, there are some things that once you do, you can't stop. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. What Franz also did not expect was the outrage among the people of the Austrian Empire at this time. However, what he did not expect even more was that the anti-French sentiment he had incited would inadvertently lead to a new war, just as the French would suddenly send troops to support the United States. Austria was also looking for opportunities to weaken the former. Anti-French sentiment was a good tool in Franz's eyes, because it would give Austria an advantage in the competition with France, and at the same time, alleviate domestic conflicts. After all, the easiest way to alleviate domestic conflicts is to transfer them, such as creating a strong enemy abroad. Of course, this emotion must be guided in an orderly manner. It is enough to boycott French goods and criticize French culture and ideas. There is no need to beat French people on the street or even burn French goods in the street. However, the people didn't care so much. Not only did they burn French goods and French flags in the streets, they even dragged French prostitutes from brothels to the streets and beat them. Even the French bull terrier was slapped twice. If the Poles can be like the Germans, Jenny thought for a while and changed her words. Austrians, then maybe Poland will not perish. Franz shook his head. You Poles have done much more than them. The latter glanced at the former and chose to shut up. In fact, she knew very well how brutal and violent her compatriots were. Franz still couldn't help but add, democracy is a good thing, but everything must be done in moderation. Just like eating too much meat will make you gain weight, and eating too much sugar will cause tooth decay. Franz didn't like the feeling of being led by public opinion, so the secret police and gendarmerie were dispatched to arrest people and focus on criticism and education. To suppress the matter, however, Franz soon received more explosive news. The Prussian army crossed the Saar River and had a fierce battle with the French army. The Baden army crossed the Rhine River and joined the battle. Chapter 559 Pawns crossing the river. When the French officer whose face was swollen had just returned to the camp before Lieutenant General Jean-Baptiste Montmorency had time to attack, a messenger ran back in panic and shouted, "No! The Prussian army has crossed the river. They dare. This is an act of war. Don't be afraid, warriors of France. The Prussians are vulnerable." Although Lieutenant General Montmorency said this, he only glanced at the number of the opponent's army with a telescope and appointed his adjutant as the temporary commander of the front line to direct the battle, while he himself chose to report to the superior. Escape. This was a completely unequal battle. Field Marshal Karl von Hagen was the commander-in-chief of the Prussian Rhine region, while Lieutenant General Montmorency was only the commander of the suppression force, with only a few thousand troops under his command. At the same time, Baden's army also crossed the Rhine River, and there was no tense confrontation. The French army decisively chose to escape after discovering that the opponent's strength was several times their own. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine already have a majority of Germans, and the locals were also angry at the atrocities committed by the French army. Therefore, when the revenge armies of Prussia and Baden arrived, a series of new murders were triggered. Although the Prussian and Baden armies immediately withdrew to their home countries after completing their revenge, Alsace and Lorraine were already in flames at this time. Prussia and Baden immediately arrested the two marshals who rashly attacked France. Louis Philippe also immediately declared in the Le Monde Français that he would make the Germans pay with blood. In fact, Louis Philippe meant to make Prussia and Baden pay the price, but obviously the content of the article was deliberately misinterpreted. When it came to the German region, it became that the French wanted to kill all the Germans. Then the German Confederation Congress was held urgently in Frankfurt. Only then did the French remember that Austria was also a part of Germany. Frankfurt, temporary conference center of the German Confederation. A large number of important figures, including Archduke John of Austria, King Friedrich William IV of Prussia, Archduke Leopold I of Baden, and Archmerchant King William III, will attend. It can be described as a gathering of stars. Archduke John is the younger brother of the old Emperor Franz II. He has been introduced before and will not be introduced in detail here. He has a wide range of hobbies and is good at diplomacy. As the temporary host, the mayor of Frankfurt felt under great pressure. He never imagined that this situation would occur today. Dear sirs, where should we start? What else? Now that the French bayonets are at our throats, do we still need to study which of you stole whose fish? Member of Parliament Calder from Luxembourg did not shy away from sarcasm. King Ludwig I of Bavaria curled his lips. He came here just for this matter. The reservoir built by Bavaria was opposed by many countries in the middle and lower reaches. Quiet, quiet. Since Archduke John and the King of Prussia were still present, Archduke Leopold I of Baden did not dare to slam the table and just shouted loudly, "Mr. Calder is right. The French are bullying others too much. They are killing my German compatriots. We must unite to protest against France." Baden was not a powerful country, and it was too close to France. If a war broke out, it would be the first to suffer, so Archduke Leopold I wanted to resolve the problem peacefully. In fact, Prussia also wanted to do so. William IV even personally ordered the arrest of Marshal Hagen, the commander of the Rhine region. However, there were exchanges of fire when the troops crossed the border. Coupled with the attitude shown by Louis Philippe, the matter did not seem to end so easily. He could only curse in his heart. Damn Hagen. Damn Louis Philippe. Damn Germans. If it weren't for them, Prussia wouldn't be in such an embarrassing situation. At this time, the Grand Duke of Württemberg put forward a different opinion, that is, the issue between Prussia and Baden. Why should the entire German Confederation be involved? As one of the 3 southern German countries, Württemberg is naturally close to France, and it does not want to be at odds with or even go to war with France. Because of other countries' affairs, this does represent the thoughts of some countries. After all, the French hammer has hit German iron-headed babies many times in the past few hundred years. In particular, the disastrous defeat during the Napoleonic Wars cast a shadow over all German states. In fact, as long as a few powerful states did not mention the war, it was useless for the small countries to mention it. Franz almost fell asleep while listening. He looked at Archduke John, who was known as the most diplomatically gifted member of the Habsburg family, and saw that the latter was gnawing on pig's trotters, and seemed to have no time to speak. This is really indecent. Franz couldn't help complaining. How could a member of the royal family do this in public? A Jenny whispered from the side. This is the style of Archduke John, and now that he is no longer a member of the royal family, he no longer needs to observe so many etiquette. Archduke John actually gave up his status as a member of the royal family for love long ago, but the Habsburg family still occasionally asked him to deal with some not so easy things. For example, in the Alsace-Lorraine crisis at this time, Archduke John both represented Austria and could not represent Austria. In short, no matter what decision was made at this German Confederation conference, the Austrian Imperial government could overturn it at any time according to its own needs. This was Metternich's diplomatic strategy, commonly known as non-stick planets. So boring. This is Franz's evaluation of this meeting so far. To be honest, he is a little disappointed that the huge German Confederation is full of such mediocre people. Those congressmen from Luxembourg really wanted to do something, but they were soft-spoken and lacked the courage of the old congressman Calder. In the end, they could only jump up and down like a bunch of fleas. Jenny smoothed her hair and said, I think it would be terrible if everyone in the world were like you. Do we need actors to save us, Franz? I'll just take it as a compliment. It seems like it's time. At this time, Archduke John finally put down the pig's trotters in his hands and stood up and said, strong enemies are everywhere, and the Dharma demon is determined to kill me, but you are here discussing who will take the blame. You feed the wolves with the meat of your own compatriots. Will the wolves be grateful to you? Wait until you feed the wolves to heights. When it's strong again, will it beg for mercy from you? Or will it eat you in one bite? In fact, everyone understands this truth, but this is the political science, based on absolute rationality. They all like to beggar their neighbors, and think that others are hellpoint. If you want to rule Germany, you must break those inherent shackles. Archduke John's heartfelt words are inspiring, but he still needs a little booster at this time. It was time for the actors who had been prepared by Franz to enter, and he winked at a Jenny. Soon someone ran to the rostrum. We are the representatives of the Germans in Alsace and Lorraine, and we need the help of the German Confederation. The French are rampant on our land, wantonly killing our compatriots, and want to destroy our culture. We now petition to join the German Confederation. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 560. Louis Philippe is scared. In fact, there are indeed some members who joined the German Confederation as vassals or territories of other countries, such as Holstein and Schleswig under the Kingdom of Denmark. Holstein is a German principality with a large number of Danes living in it. Schleswig is a principality in Denmark, mainly Danes, but there are also many German residents historically. These two principalities were not formal members of the German Confederation, but Franz brought the two principalities into the German Confederation in order to open up the Danish market. Denmark is naturally very willing to gain access to the vast market in Germany, so both parties feel that they have made a profit. Franz likes this win-win cooperation model very much. After all, this is the field he is familiar with. Archduke John expressed his welcome to the sudden application for joining. Now that the Austrian Empire has decided on this matter, other small states naturally have no reason to object. Even Prussia, which usually wants to compete with Austria for dominance, must restrain itself at this time point. After all, this crisis was strictly caused by Prussia. In theory, Austria could stay out and watch the excitement. The happiest people now are those German nationalists. They all feel that they have witnessed a historic moment. The German nation has united and fought for the same goal. Franz looked at the happy scene, silently stood up, and left to hide his merit and fame. If France had not temporarily intervened in the just ended US-Mexico war, I'm afraid that, even if the Americans did not cede territory and pay compensation, they would have had no choice but to admit defeat and return without success. Franz understands the logic of the French's behavior. Austria has too many conflicts of interest with it, and the two must decide a winner. So now it's Austria's turn. In fact, from the outbreak of the Alsace-Lorraine crisis, the Austrian Empire's diplomatic system began to operate at full capacity. Both Britain and Russia have been invited by the Austrian Empire, but before the 4th Congress of Vienna can be held, France must first win on the battlefield. In fact, so Nicholas, I really did not want France's power to continue to grow, whether it was out of fear or hatred. In short, he was a staunch anti-French element. After receiving the information from Austria, the Tsar himself even publicly told his ministers that France would never be allowed to make a comeback. In Britain, Robert Peel was extremely dissatisfied with George Hamilton's previous handling of the Mexican-American War. The former felt that the latter had undermined Britain's long-standing policy of neutrality and allowed France to gain too many benefits. Robert Peel believed that Britain should strictly adhere to a policy of neutrality, but Charles Canning had a different opinion. Charles Canning was the youngest son of George Canning. He became a member of the House of Commons in 1836. At this time, he was the British Under Secretary of Foreign Affairs and was deeply trusted by Prime Minister Robert Peel. As a member of the Canning family, he also inherited the anti-Austrian characteristics. Your Majesty Prime Minister, our mission in the UK is to maintain the balance of power on the European continent, but Russia and Austria have obviously achieved too many victories. Their excessive strength will inevitably lead to the collapse of the European structure, which we do not want to see. Robert Peel. Charles, believe me, France is far more terrifying than Austria or Russia. They have just acquired nearly 600,000 square kilometers of land in North America, which is larger than France in Europe. Just because of our contempt for France, we later participated in more than one anti-French alliance. As for the Austrians, just look at North America and you will know that these landlubbers have absolutely no way to deal with colonial matters. And believe me, Austria is a national prison. All it takes is a fire to detonate this bomb. When the time comes, it will be up to us to prevent it from becoming the second Poland. Robert Peel spoke with confidence. Charles Canning knew that the Prime Minister acted like this after receiving reliable intelligence, but he still fought for it. Your Majesty Prime Minister, then we should also warn the warring parties not to undermine the Vienna system, to prevent either party from becoming too powerful. Robert Peel, that makes sense. Let's do what you say. I still have to deal with the problems in the east. Damn it. These idiots in the navy were actually attacked by king pirates. Then, France and Austria both received stern warnings from Britain, which made Louis Philippe very depressed. Because he originally thought that the British would come to persuade them to make peace. But in the end, the British's warning seemed to say, fight as you like, but don't kill people. Land, although the news from Russia has not come, I also know that it will not be on my side. The declaration of war of the German Confederacy had arrived, to the effect that the members of the Confederacy were to be protected. Louis Philippe, damn it, why did my territory become a member of the German Confederation? The British warning was like a piece of waste paper to the German states. After all, they no longer relied on British goods, and they were not afraid of a naval blockade. Even if they took a step back, the warning was written to Austria. Archduke Albrecht once again took command and went on an expedition. He felt that this time it should be a big battle. After all, the attack was on the French mainland. Thanks to the railway system within the German Confederation, the Allied forces gathered nearly 200,000 troops before the official war began. Although the French fought on their own soil, they only gathered a force of 100,000 troops in the same period of time. At this time, Louis Philippe discovered that France's power was already stretched thin. Spain, Morocco, Algeria, El Salvador, Guatemala, Texas, the new colonies of North America, Asia, Africa, Oceania, and South America were everywhere. It's pulling on its energy point. Although France is a large country, there are less than 300,000 local regular troops left, while the apparent strength of the German allied forces exceeds 1 million. At the same time, the more severe letter from the Tsar reached Louis Philippe. The Tsar said in the letter, if France wants to relive its old dream, Russia will remind it of whom it was defeated. Nicholas I's attitude was very clear. He would not only support the German allied forces spiritually, but would even send troops to join the new anti-French alliance. This greatly angered the French Bonapartists, who still dispute whether it was the Russian generals who defeated the First French Empire or General Winter who defeated the First French Empire. The Tsar actually used this to humiliate France, which made the French generals furious. Paris newspapers are also trying their best to build momentum for this war. After all, the July dynasty has done too many things to hurt the feelings of the French nation. Mainly due to Guizot, he made concessions to the British in various diplomatic frictions, selling out national interests to please the British during the Turkish-Egyptian War, the Viceroyalty of La Plata, and Central American events. Then, just as the two sides were at war with each other, Louis Philippe gave up. When he issued that fiery declaration, he completely forgot about Austria, the chairman of the German Federation, and he did not expect that the latter's revenge would come so quickly. The attitude of Britain and Russia was the last straw that crushed him. Chapter 561 Alsace-Lorraine. Louis Philippe himself only wanted to take advantage, and never wanted to have a head-on fight with the entire Germany, or even the anti-French alliance. And in the eyes of the French king, the demands made by the German Confederation were not excessive. 1. Allow the Germans in Alsace and Lorraine to establish their own parliament. 2. Any punishment must go through a reasonable trial. 3. Schools in Alsace-Lorraine must have Alsatian language courses. Alsatian is actually a dialect of German. 4. Local culture should be respected and not discriminated against. 5. It is forbidden to massacre and persecute local Germans. 6. Compensate the victims for their losses. After all, apart from compensation, there seemed to be no clauses that would endanger Louis Philippe himself. However, in the early days, there were still many militant groups in France, and some even proposed borrowing troops from Spain. This made Prime Minister Sert sneer. Spain? If it weren't for our two French legions, totaling 80,000 people, I'm afraid a new round of civil war would break out at any time. The Bonapartists suddenly became quiet. In fact, they had strong objections to Soult, the second minister and traitor, but they couldn't do anything about it. After all, Sert is the prime minister, the most powerful person in the country besides the king. And he knew very well that he could not fight this battle if he wanted to retire honorably. Of course, the current situation in France did not allow this battle. Not to mention the young Bonapartists. Even the citizens of Paris might stand up and exorcise these feudal remnants. Although Soult is old, he is not confused. He knows the scandals done by businessmen and capitalists. If it were during the Great Revolution, he would have been guillotined long ago. France is no longer the France it once was, and Germany is no longer the Germany it once was. French intelligence officers were not blind. They knew about the changes in Austria and the German Confederation. It was just that the top officials were unwilling to believe in these changes. I agree with His Majesty the King that the Germans' demands are not harsh. For the sake of France, Europe, and even world peace, we should accept this proposal. Or if any of you can find a way to break into Berlin in 18 days and then capture Vienna, maybe we still have the possibility to negotiate with the Russians. As for the expedition to Moscow, I think it's better to forget it. After all, winter is coming soon. Soult's words made the Bonapartists feel humiliated again. But they did not have the ability to defeat the German allied forces. In fact, it would have been good if Austria did not take back these two places, or get a Grand Duke to be the king like in Liege and Namur. After all, the paternal ancestor of the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty was the last Duke of Lorraine. and his maternal ancestor also once ruled Alsace. Historically, France and Austria have repeatedly competed for this area. But after the Napoleonic Wars, the great powers, including Britain, hoped to turn it into an Austrian enclave. But Francis II, who was overconfident, insisted on conducting a public opinion poll. As a result, 80% of the local people expressed their willingness to stay in France. The good-looking old emperor could only give it up to others. But at this moment, France was once a beacon of European civilization and democracy and a twisted feudal monster of the Austrian Empire. Now the economic development rate of the latter is much faster than that of the former, and the influence of science, technology, culture, and thought is also expanding. Coupled with the French government's indiscriminate and bloody suppression, the local Germans could not help but begin to waver, especially those young people who have not experienced the French Revolution. They have no idea why they should love those who oppress them, and those who treat them as nothing. Although the tradition of loyalty to France cannot be changed for a while, these things are like nails inserted into the cracks of France. The seeds of separatism have been sown, and it is unclear whether France will rely on its own light and heat to dispel the gloom, or whether it will be watered with blood and sin to help it grow. In fact, this war was strictly speaking France's declaration of war on the German Confederation, and Austria, Prussia and other countries were forced to fight. After all, Louis Philippe claimed that the Germans would pay the price with blood, instead of tracing back to the source, that the Tsar also had German ancestry, and the British royal family was sent out from the German region. Rounding things off like this, Louis Philippe was declaring war on all of Europe. In fact, there was a debate within the German Confederation about how to punish France. Prussia hopes that it can take over Alsace and Lorraine. After all, they will be threatened by France at any time. Alsace-Lorraine is an important industrial area, producing high-quality coal and iron resources, which can further promote the development of the Rhine region. Cross out, not to be outdone, Baden stated that he was also a member of the German Confederation, and also had geographical advantages. Alsace and Lorraine should be equally divided with Prussia. Bavaria said that it has many enclaves, and is experienced in governing them, and that the Wittelsbach family should rule Alsace-Lorraine. Other powerful states are also coveting the wealth and potential of Alsace-Lorraine, and have given their own opinions, and some national representatives have even proposed taking turns to rule. Small states such as Luxembourg hope that Alsace-Lorraine can become a parliamentary country and join the German Confederation as an independent country. Countries that supported Austria proposed that the Austrian emperor or a certain archduke should serve as king, just like the previous Duchy of Liege. Even before the war started, they were already considering how to divide the spoils. France felt very helpless. He did not think that France in this era was a country that could easily surrender, but Louis Philippe is indeed a man who gives in easily. As long as the conditions are loose enough, the other party will not care about influence and reputation. In fact, France did not agree with the proposals of these countries. No matter who handed Alsace-Lorraine to anyone, it would be equivalent to signing an armistice agreement with France that could be torn up at any time. As for turning Alsace-Lorraine into a principality, the Austrian emperor or a certain archduke would also serve as king. This approach is tantamount to putting the Austrian Empire on the fire. France and Prussia will work together to roast Austria until it is charred on the outside and tender on the inside. This time Franz rarely reached an agreement with the Prime Minister. Metternich expressed his willingness to go to Paris in person to make Louis Philippe accept the conditions of the German Confederation. There are different opinions within the German Confederation on this two-light agreement. Some people think it is a manifestation of the kindness of the Habsburg family, while others think it is a cowardly approach. Of course, more of it is dissatisfaction with the inability to obtain actual benefits, and at least the German states should be compensated for their military expenses. Nationalists are advocating war. After all, steel can only become strong by quenching it. War that can only be a last resort option. Of course, it is still necessary to show strength, otherwise the so-called agreement will be just a blank piece of paper. Chapter 562 Trip to France. Paris, France. The Bonapartists firmly opposed the preconditions for negotiations proposed by the German Confederation. After all, Alsace-Lorraine was French territory, so why should the French army have to withdraw from the area together with the German army? However, Louis Philippe did not care about these trivial issues. Anyway, he would not suffer if both sides withdraw at the same time, not to mention that the coalition forces had already taken the lead in withdrawing from Alsace-Lorraine. In order to show their sincerity in the negotiations, therefore, Louis Philippe agreed to the terms of negotiation with the German Confederation early on without the approval of Congress. The Bonapartists felt it was a shame to sue for peace without fighting, while the legitimists seized the opportunity to criticize Louis Philippe for his weakness and incompetence. The alliancists were concerned about the king's increasing interference in state affairs. In fact, the July monarchy was a constitutional monarchy, but the king's power was not small, and he was not a complete mascot. Theoretically, Louis Philippe could dissolve parliament, appoint and remove the prime minister, and directly issue edicts without permission from parliament. The Bonapartists and the Orthodox were the traditional opponents within the July monarchy, and their reactions were understandable, while the alliancists were an interest group deeply bound to Louis Philippe and even the July monarchy. But ever since Louis Philippe's youngest son became engaged to the theoretical Queen of Spain, he was no longer the puppet of the financial capitalists. After all, power breeds ambition, and once you've tried to have it, it's hard to give it up. However, Louis Philippe himself did not feel that he was weak, or even that he was suing for peace, but that he was just reaching some kind of agreement with the German Confederation. As for unconstitutional things, you will get used to them if you do them too often. In Louis Philippe's view, the Bonapartists were a group of idiots who failed to achieve anything but failed. In particular, Jeanne d'Arc's operations directly caused France to lose the province of Namur, the French-speaking part of Belgium, and even more so. Louis Philippe was even more convinced of this. Those people miss France's past glory all day long. Why don't they go to accompany Napoleon? That short-sighted Corsican dwarf would only betray his country and give up France's land to the Americans, and he, the real king of France, Louis Philippe, would take back what France had lost from the United States and Mexico. One was a scum who betrayed his country and died, and the other was a victor who expanded his territory. Comparing the two, the Orleans dynasty was far better than the Napoleonic Empire. The delegation of the German Confederation set out from Vienna and sailed to the French port of Toulon via Genoa in the Kingdom of Sardinia. Metternich received what he thought was a warm welcome from the French. As soon as he got off the ship, the long corridor composed of 4 salutes and 140 cavalry was of high standard, but there was an uncomfortable feeling everywhere. Later, the Bonapartist officials ordered people to play Marseillaise. Although Louis Philippe ascended to the throne during the July Revolution of 1830, accompanied by barricades and Marseillaise, for a kingdom it's still a taboo. With the passionate Marseillaise playing, the Bonapartist goal of humiliating Austria was achieved. But they seem to have forgotten one thing, that is, the original name of Marseillaise is Military Song of the Rhine Army. And it also has a German name called March to the Rhine region, and even the area where this song first began to be sung was its Alsace-Lorraine. At this time, the Prussian representative Heinrich von Bülow's face became very ugly. You must know that the Rhineland was Prussia's territory at this time, and Prussia was also beaten badly during the Napoleonic Wars, so this song not only insults that's an insult. The other representatives of the German Confederation also had ugly expressions on their faces. They all had objections to this piece of music. After all, the German region had been the target of French ravages for centuries. Metternich was completely unmoved and took it calmly. After all, he had experienced scenes that were 10,000 times more humiliating than this. But in any case, this La Marseillaise did temporarily unite the German Confederation negotiating team that had previously had their own evil intentions. Afterwards, the French official arrogantly introduced to the German delegation the crystallization of French wisdom, a train with a speed of up to 30 kilometers per hour. He also deliberately added an accent to the word train. Although the French official said it with a serious face, the German representatives thought it was a cold joke and keenly caught the laughing point. After all, telling cold jokes is one of the stereotypes left to the world by the Germans. Naturally, a group of people cannot laugh too wildly on behalf of the country, but the scene of holding back laughter makes the French feel even more uncomfortable. What's so funny about this? Don't you know that laughing in public is a sign of lack of education? Faced with the insulting questions from the French officials, the representatives of the German Confederation realized that it was not a joke, and then showed even more contemptuous smiles on their faces. Prince Metternich did not speak to the young French official at all. He directly passed him and whispered a few words to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs official responsible for the reception, and then patted the other party's shoulder. The latter immediately started sweating profusely, and even took out a handkerchief and wiped it back and forth on his bare forehead, bowing and thanking Metternich again in the direction he left. The other members of the negotiating team did not have the discipline and authority of His Highness the Prince, so they all replied, "The slowest speed of our German Confederate trains is 40 km per hour, and the latest test train has a speed of close to 60 km per hour. A frog in the well. The crystallization of French wisdom. Train 30 km is so fast." In fact, initially Germany, especially North Germany, lagged far behind France in terms of railway and train technology. The earliest steam railway in France had a speed of only 4 km per hour, and horses were even used before that. The situation in Austria was similar to the form of the first train used when the first railway in North Germany was opened. The Adler had a speed of only 8 km per hour and a traction capacity of only 550 kilograms. However, it was quickly replaced by more advanced Austrian products, which did not leave too deep an impression on people. However, due to Franz's intervention, the railway technology in the German region advanced rapidly. In the early days, it was on par with the United Kingdom, and later it overtook the country in a corner. The invention of the compound expansion steam engine made the dream of 60 km per hour easily a reality. However, after reaching a speed of 60 km per hour, Franz urgently cut back on the funds he wanted to use steam power to continue accelerating. Because Franz knew the upper limit of this kind of machinery. Although the British had developed a steam locomotive with a top speed of 100 km per hour, it could only operate for a short period of time, and was not practical at all. Considering efficiency and practicality, Franz felt that a speed of 60 km per hour was enough, and the remaining money could be used to research newer models of internal combustion engines. Of course, steam trains are no longer researched, but the weight can be relatively lowered to give way to more urgent technologies. Although Franz didn't know the upper limit of the steam engine, he had seen the green train, which could reach a speed of 50 or 60 km per hour in the era of internal combustion engines. The speed of trains can stably exceed 100 km at this time. The Austrian Empire's land area in Europe was only more than 700,000 square kilometers, with the north to south being only 700 kilometers, and the east to west being only 1,400 kilometers. The speed requirements for trains were really not too high. Chapter 563 Belated Toughness. Back to the main story. The representatives of those small states, many of them are orators in the parliament, and have rich experience in struggle. They have no say at all in the meetings of the German Confederation as a weak country, and they usually dare not offend a big country like France. But at this moment, they represented the German Confederation, and Louis Philippe invited them, and these people began to jump up and down, bragging. France's technology is #1 in the world, while the young official was hysterically rebutting the taunts of the German Confederation representatives. Two French officers and soldiers took the former away. A personable French officer said, "I deeply apologize for disturbing you. This person is trapped by love." What he just said may have been offensive to everyone in the German Confederation. Please forgive me. All the veterans present knew that this was a public relations emergency. Although they didn't want to make the matter a bigger deal, they didn't forget to make a few mocking remarks. As expected of France, "It's so romantic." The officer continued to smile. "Wish you all a happy journey." When he left, he passed by Prince Metternich, who couldn't help but take a second look. "Your Highness, you still have a way." As soon as Metternich came back, a representative from a small country gave him a slap in the face. "But the Prime Minister has been in power for so many years, and has long been accustomed to this kind of thing. That kid is so young, and he's not from a noble family. He's actually been able to reach such a high level. It seems like young people in France shouldn't be underestimated. Everyone was a little confused by His Highness the Prince's meaningless words, but there is no doubt that today is the day of victory for the German Confederacy. At the same time, the French troops in Alsace-Lorraine did not retreat. Although the king's order had come long ago, the local supreme commander, Marshal Emmanuel Grouchy, chose to ignore it. Emmanuel Grouchy is the man who once made Napoleon dream of him, the first historical inventor in French history, and the originator of the blame game. People say that Feng Tangyi Lao, Li Guan was difficult to seal, and Grouchy made the mistake of not obeying Napoleon's orders. Grouchy was worthy of being an outstanding cavalry general during the French Revolution, and his performance was remarkable until Waterloo. But after that, this man started a verbal spat with Napoleon, and the latter published a book, The War of 1815, to severely criticize the former facing his old employer. Grouchy immediately fought back without fear, and published a book, Views on the Narration of the War of 1815 inches in the United States to refute Napoleon. At that time, Grouchy fled to the United States to escape liquidation, and later became one of the first Bonapartists to accept the influence of the Bourbon family. It's okay to blame each other, but Grouchy's book contains many forged and tampered orders, quotes many famous quotes that have never been said by famous people, and even invented some histories that do not exist. As a result, not only did Grouchy fail to prove his own success, but his credibility was compromised. However, hundreds of years later, some people complained about Grouchy and even classified him as a god general. The German allied forces on the other side of the river, composed of dozens of countries, were naturally chaotic, which was severely despised by Marshal Grouchy. The Germans are still the same as before. Grouchy raised his telescope again and saw that one of the armies was well organized and well defended, and everything in the camp was in order. Another look at the flag shows the army of the Austrian Empire. Grouchy managed to squeeze out a sentence, "The Austrians are okay," but then he smiled. It's a pity that the commander of the army is an idiot. He actually set up his camp at such a low ground, and by the river. He is simply the stupidest pig among stupid pigs. At this time, the adjutant said cautiously, "Marshal, how should Paris respond?" "Paris? What news? Why don't I know about it?" Seeing the marshal pretending to be dumbfounded, the adjutant naturally couldn't say anything else, because "I don't know" was his attitude. However, the adjutant was still a little worried. After all, the German allied forces across the river from Marshal Grouchy's troops had nearly 3 times their strength. If the two sides fight, no matter how weak the other side is, our side will still be left with nothing to eat. Moreover, messengers from the coalition forces have come several times, with the purpose of urging the French army to leave Alsace-Lorraine as soon as possible. The adjutant asked tentatively, "Your Excellency, Marshal, there is another letter from the Germans." Grouchy, "We are French. The Germans have no right to order us to leave our own land. Alsace-Lorraine has been French territory since ancient times. I'm here to protect France." Grouchy turned to the reporter and said, "Have you remembered everything? Don't make a mistake in remembering a word. Napoleon is just a coward. I, Emmanuel Grouchy, am the most determined Frenchman." The reporter on the side said, "I have remembered it all." Grouchy took out a full envelope and handed it to the reporter and said quietly, "Write it carefully, preferably so that everyone in Paris can read my words. If the matter is completed, I will reward you. Don't worry, I will rush back to Paris now, and tomorrow this newspaper will be spread all over the streets of Paris. Okay, 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 then I'll take my leave now." The reporter took off his hat. Grouchy also waved his hand symbolically. After the reporter left, Grouchy's tone suddenly became cold. "Bring those people up, adjutant." "Your Excellency, Marshal, isn't it good now? And they are just farmers. There is no need to take it too seriously, right?" In fact, the adjutant was beating a drum in his heart. After all, the last time Lieutenant General Montmorency was executed by the river, he angered the Germans on the other side of the river. There are hundreds of thousands of people on the other side now, and His Majesty the King has ordered a truce. It might not be good if a fight breaks out. Grouchy said angrily. Aren't these crimes enough for collaborating with the enemy, wreaking havoc on French soil, and refusing to be drafted? We are executing people on French soil. What right do they have to interfere? Montmorency only has a few thousand people, while I have an army of 100,000. And from my point of view, the German allied forces are no more than local chickens and Watkins. Marshall is mighty. The adjutant was too lazy to persuade. In fact, he didn't think that the miscellaneous army on the other side of the river could win. After all, France was on the defensive. If the coalition forces chose to forcefully cross the river, they could choose to attack them halfway across the river at that time. Maybe we can win a wild victory and make His Majesty the King change his mind. After all, there are many examples in history of attacking halfway through and achieving great victories. However, in this Bonapartist's view, at least the French army would not be defeated. A fight can completely boost the morale of France, and at the same time, provide more bargaining chips for negotiations. It will also hurt the opponent before they dare to make any excessive demands. In fact, the Bonapartists and the Orthodox faction chose to cover up the truth and spread rumors in order to attack the Orleans faction and gain more support for themselves. The Germans are preparing to attack France. They want to capture Alsace-Lorraine. In addition to spreading in the army, these people also spread in Alsace-Lorraine with the purpose of inciting hatred. It's just that the locals had just been massacred by the French army and rescued by the coalition forces. At this time, they really couldn't muster any patriotic enthusiasm. Instead, some extreme nationalists took the opportunity to incite the people to do a lot of things, such as burning the French army's fodder. Some type of point. That's why today's massacre occurred. Of course, these people later became known as the Black 13, to commemorate the sacrifices they made for the local area. Chapter 564 War begins. On the other side of the Rhine, the German allied forces command a rabble is what Archduke Albrecht said about the coalition forces, especially the volunteer armies composed of civilians from small countries. But it was not that he looked down upon those people. On the contrary, Archduke Albrecht admired the courage of these people, but he also felt that war should be a matter for soldiers. It is a failure of the government and the army to let untrained civilians go to the battlefield, so there are no civilians in his army, and even the transport team is composed of soldiers. The weapons of the volunteers can be said to be diverse, ranging from cold weapons to muskets and matchlocks of the 16th and 17th centuries, to flintlock muskets, needle guns, homemade cannons, and even beach cannons. Beach cannons are similar to elm cannons during the anti-Japanese war. Although they are stronger, the wood is still wood after all. First find a thick beech wood, saw it open, hollow out the middle, and put it into the barrel. This kind of barrel cannot meet the requirements of a real barrel, usually because the bore wall is too thin, and then use a few iron bars to cut the beech wood into pieces. Refasten it and drill holes for the fuse. It is also very simple to use. Just put gunpowder, iron pieces, stones, glass and other things together. The advantages are that it is easy to obtain materials, simple to manufacture, and has strong lethality at close range. The disadvantages are also very obvious. The range is too close, the power is limited, and it is difficult to target solid objects. The fortifications caused substantial damage. In fact, the cost of this thing was not much cheaper than a regular iron cannon, because the woods usually belonged to the nobles at that time. This era was also an era of rapid development of the shipbuilding industry, so beech wood, which is very cheap now, was not cheap at that time. Not to mention that the beech wood used to make beech cannons was all old and high quality beech wood that met certain specifications in addition to weapons and clothing. It is impossible to unify the colorful and fishy style. But what really annoyed Archduke Albrecht was the discipline of this group of people. Even the most notorious mercenaries would not be worse than them when they were bragging, drinking, playing cards, and acting drunk. However, this situation was within Franz's expectation, so it was completely normal for one or two coalition soldiers to disappear in the Alsace-Lorraine region. Albrecht didn't like this excuse for starting a war, but looking at the chaotic scene at this time, he felt it was reasonable. At this time, an officer suddenly shouted, "Grand Duke, the French army on the other side of the river is massacring again." Upon Hearing this, all the generals in the headquarters hurriedly picked up their binoculars and went outside to take a look. Sure enough, the French on the other side of the river had come up with something new. The French soldiers tied some poor people in front of the muzzle of the cannon and let those people howl and struggle to no avail. Artillery execution was the thought that flashed through everyone's mind. As the name suggests, artillery execution is the use of cannons to execute prisoners. This method is very bloody and shocking. The high-speed shells will break the human body into pieces. A reason why Grouchy chose to do this was not only to humiliate, but also to show his strength. After all, only large caliber high quality artillery can really crush people. At the same time, placing the artillery on the riverbank also served as a warning to the coalition forces that they wanted to cross the river. People are what you end up with. Call everyone over here. Albrecht roared angrily, and other officers immediately got busy upon seeing this. In fact, there was no need for the officers to shout. Many soldiers had already gathered near the riverbank. After all, they came here because of this incident. The French soldiers were laughing and talking while holding water-soaked mops to clean the barrels of the cannons. After all, scenes of artillery duels were rare, unless they were in places like Morocco or Guatemala, where rebellions abounded. Another French soldier pierced the gunpowder bag and sprinkled the excess gunpowder on the prisoner. The latter twitched obviously out of fear, which caused a burst of laughter. Look, those cowards. Grouchy also laughed loudly. The solid bullet was put into the muzzle, and the next outcome was already within everyone's expectations with the roar of the new 12-pound field cannon. The intense fire engulfed the victim, leaving only the green smoke rising from the muzzle. The victims were scattered everywhere like pieces of broken porcelain. 1, 2, 3, 4, until the last victim passed away. The coalition forces on the other side of the river were silent. At this time, a military chaplain sang a requiem, and the soldiers and officers also sang voluntarily. A sad atmosphere spread throughout the army, and Albrecht only had murderous intent in his eyes. In fact, he had already made a battle plan with Franz. Although this was not the best time, France sent the best motivation. Shut up. France is attacking us. Shells have fallen on our camp. Prepare to attack. Albrecht mounted his horse and galloped wildly through the camp. As he roared, the drumbeats of the military musicians immediately changed, becoming rapid and murderous. In fact, the boat used to cross the river has been prepared long ago, and the pontoon bridge is also ready upstream. As long as the cable is cut off, a new pontoon bridge can be built here. While going downstream, the soldiers immediately prepared for battle and performed their duties. After all, there was no better mobilization for war than this. The coalition forces began to forcefully cross the Rhine River, which surprised the French army on the other side. After all, the French, including Grouchy, did not think that the Austrian army dared to forcefully cross the Rhine River, but in fact the distance between the two sides is only 120 meters, which is why Albrecht chose this place to camp. Although it is not suitable for defense, it is very suitable for offense. Moreover, it was the dry season of the Rhine River at this time. The depth was only about 1 meter, and the flow rate in this section of the river was relatively slow. Grouchy was certainly not mediocre in being able to achieve so many victories. He would not be intimidated by such emergencies. On the contrary, he felt that the time had come for him to surpass Napoleon. Grouchy didn't think there was anything wrong with inventing history. After all, history is written by the victors, and his only mistake was failure. So Grouchy planned to be the winner, and he immediately ordered the cannon to be fired. The quality of the French soldiers was worthy of the title of the strongest army in Europe at this time. The cannons previously used for executions immediately turned into defensive weapons, and the French troops on standby in the town also rushed to support them. However, the artillery that Grouchy had high hopes for failed to cause much damage to the coalition forces crossing the river. Instead, the excessive forward pressure of his own artillery position, execution ground, gave the Austrian artillery a chance to show off its skills. Several consecutive artillery shells accurately landed on the French artillery position. It was intended to let the German Allied forces see clearly, but now it unexpectedly caused trouble. In fact, in addition to Grouchy's excessive and aggressive exposure of the artillery to the sight of the Austrian artillery, the new breech-loading rifled gun also made a great contribution. In fact, rifled guns are not a new thing. They appeared in the 17th century, but they quickly disappeared in the long river of history due to too many shortcomings. When Franz was studying breech-loading rifled guns, he inspired artillery designers to create breech-loading rifled guns. This finally solved the problem of difficulty in loading rifled guns and made it truly valuable in combat. Chapter 565 Beating. The artillery positions were completely suppressed, which was a great disadvantage during this period. As a famous general, Grouchy naturally understood that his plan to attack half-crossed was ruined. He did not hesitate and immediately chose to retreat. After all, artillery was too precious, and it would be too much of a loss to exchange it with the coalition infantry. As a result, the French army, which still had the upper hand at this time, actually retreated, which made the coalition soldiers extremely excited. The remaining French army lost the cover of artillery fire and could only fight and retreat. People kept climbing over the slope to escape, and the war continued. Victory seemed close at hand. However, this was just a death trap set by Grouchy for the coalition forces. The French soldiers on the other side of the slope had already been waiting for the hot-blooded coalition soldiers to rush over and start a killing spree. In fact, although the French army's formation was scattered, it was not an orderly retreat, and the counterattack was also very organized. If a general with a sharp eye should be able to see that the opponents left in the rear were actually skirmishers, this is the anti-slope tactic Grouchy learned from the British. In fact, the ancestor of this thing is the Frenchman Lafayette, who used this tactic to beat the crap out of the British in North America. But later the British learned it and beat the hell out of the French in Spain, especially the column tactics that the French were proud of. However, the French army behind the slope waited for a long time and did not wait for the expected coalition soldiers. At this time, a large group of coalition dragoons bypassed the slope and went straight to the back of the French army. The most feared thing about this anti-slope tactic is a flanking attack. Soon this elite French force had to choose to surrender. Grouchy didn't understand why the other party could easily decipher his tactics and couldn't stop looking back. Even after leaving the battlefield. At this time, he discovered the key. Several huge hot air balloons were hanging in the sky. They were the eyes of the coalition forces. Damn. It's a tactical hot air balloon, Grouchy cursed, but it was of no use at this point. But although he lost the first battle, he should be able to protect himself. While Grouchy withdrew the army to his carefully built camp, he sent people to question why the coalition forces suddenly launched the attack. To be honest, he did not expect that the morale of the coalition forces was high enough to cross the river under artillery fire, let alone that the Austrian artillery would be so accurate. Tactical hot air balloons were one of the artifacts used by the French to defeat Europe, but later the French army gradually forgot about them. Unexpectedly, today the Austrians would use hot air balloons to teach them a lesson. Grouchy thought that he would bring some hot air balloons next time to earn back his face. The first thing he did when he returned to the camp was to write a letter to Louis Philippe, who wanted to tell His Majesty what happened here. The Austrians launched a despicable and shameless sneak attack on our army, resulting in the capture of thousands of soldiers. This is not my fault. There are actually traitors who are at work and destroying our army's logistics. Please rest assured, His Majesty the King, we are still capable of fighting, and all our soldiers are willing to die for France. Before Grouchy could finish writing the letter, an explosion sounded in the air. Albrecht has been waiting for this day for a long time, and Franz's intention must be for to let the French know the pain, so that Louis Philippe will not change his mind, and the Prime Minister's negotiations can be more confident. Therefore, Albrecht directly ignored Grouchy's questioning. The former directly ordered the attack. With the hot air balloon as guidance, the Austrian artillery could always carry out key strikes on important targets of the French army, which greatly weakened the French army's combat effectiveness. Rockets are a more terrifying thing than artillery. The overwhelming rockets directly turned the French camp into a sea of fire. Directly engaging in an infantry decisive battle without the assistance of artillery is like catching someone else's fist with your face. Unless you are Luffy, it is difficult to win. The French army could only be forced to abandon the camp and retreat again. However, the battle was still not over. It encountered several interceptions on the road. Naturally, the losses caused by being flanked from both sides were not small. The pursuit did not end until late at night. By the time the French army broke away from the battle, there were only less than 20,000 troops left out of 60,000. Of course, most of them were dispersed or captured, and the actual death toll was not high. The coalition forces took more than 20,000 prisoners. More than 1,700 were killed, and more than 5,000 were injured. However, when the coalition announced the war report, they also included the number of civilian casualties in Alsace-Lorraine that was affected by the war and bloody suppression. This number is terrifying. 18,000 people died, and more than 30,000 people were injured. The next day in Paris was very exciting. Louis Philippe met with the German Confederation delegation in the early morning. At this time, the latter happened to receive a report that the French had withdrawn their troops without fulfilling the agreement, which made Metternich and the German delegation very unhappy. His Royal Highness Louis Philippe, where is your sincerity? Our German allied forces have retreated, but why did your army not leave, Louis? Philippe was speechless for a moment, but when he opened the Paris journal, he suddenly felt enlightened. It was full of Groucho's heroic words. Louis Philippe calmly handed the newspaper to Prince Metternich, who frowned after reading it. He did not expect the Frenchman to be so bellicose. Metternich handed the newspaper to the rest of the delegation. After reading it, everyone had different expressions, but listening to the shouts outside the window, it seemed that the French people were very supportive of the war. The vast majority of politicians in the German Confederation did not want to conflict with France. The purpose of sending troops at this time was entirely to deflect domestic conflicts and satisfy the demands of nationalists. However, the momentum was already weaker before the negotiations began. Louis Philippe was very happy. He could see the worry on the other person's face, which made him feel that it was Germany, not France, that needed peace. However, battle reports from the front line soon came one after another, and Louis Philippe's attitude changed from arrogance to panic, especially the seemingly righteous letter. That was extremely ironic at this time. In the morning Paris was filled with Groucho's heroic words, but in the evening it turned into sad news of defeat. As a result, people pointed their fingers at the historical inventor, and Louis Philippe roared angrily, "Grouchy, why are you there?" Grouchy was still writing his third letter. Here I have to talk about the Bonapartists at this time. Although these people were under the banner of Napoleon, they turned a blind eye to the several heirs of the Bonaparte family. Instead, they expanded their power without scruples. Even former enemies, as long as they are famous enough, they will also attract them, such as Marshal Grouchy. However, 3 defeats in one day not only disgraced Louis Philippe, but also disgraced France. Louis Philippe had to accept the merciful agreement offered by the German Confederation in exchange for peace. Afterwards, the German allied forces withdrew from Alsace-Lorraine again, as agreed, and returned French prisoners and equipment. In the end, the French attributed the defeats to the commander's incompetence, and Grouchy followed in Napoleon's footsteps and was exiled to the French islands in Central America. The reasons were dereliction of duty, disobedience, and making Louis Philippe cry. Chapter 566 Extra. Dream Japan 200 years ago. The original free chapter became a VIP chapter, and then I posted another free chapter. However, due to mechanical issues, I had to unlock this chapter to have a chance to get a recommendation spot, so I wrote another article instead. I'm sorry. 1637, Kyushu, Japan. On the sea between the Shimabara Peninsula and the Amakusa Islands, strange warships with black sails are sailing towards the Shimabara Peninsula. This is a world full of war. The 30 Years' War was in full swing in the west. In the east, there was a large-scale peasant uprising in the Ming dynasty, and the Qing army invaded the country. Other wars were also ongoing. On the Japanese island of Kyushu, natural disasters continued. Farmers ate bark and bark roots to satisfy their hunger, and borrowed rice from the feudal government many times. The two lords ignored them, and only used severe torture to force rent. The villager Yaman and his relatives and friends were driven beyond endurance by this atrocity, and gathered 700 to 800 people to surround and set fire to the Lord Tanaka's house. Tanaka fled into the castle, but the people forced them outside the castle and burned the streets. Later, Amakusa farmers also joined in, and this became the famous Amakusa uprising. The shogunate gathered heavy troops and prepared to completely wipe out the Amakusa army. At this time, those strange warships with black sails on the sea were filled with a terrible stench, and chewing sounds could be heard from time to time. The tall Ronin leader ordered, and then each Ronin with scholar eyes on the boat dropped their human corpses in their hands, let out a piercing roar, and prepared to charge towards the shogunate army on the shore. Come to the island, the navy general of the shogunate, the initiator of the rogues' landing. He was on a small island that served as a pirate stronghold, watching all this quietly. Kuroshima doesn't think that a few ships of Ronin can change the situation of the battle, but he does not want Amakusa Shiro to fail. Although the farmers who had no food to eat were pitiful, he did not sympathize with them. Ladeo does not want Amakusa to fail. The most important reason is profit. The reason why Kashima enjoys such a high status is because he has a huge fleet. With the existence of this fleet, the islanders can continuously deliver goods from all over the world to Japan, and at the same time rob other countries' merchant ships, monopolize trade, and earn huge profits. But now that the shogunate wants to close the country, this has undoubtedly touched the back of him. Kuroshima Yasuo. Whether it's swords, iron cannons, or helping him transport demon soldiers. In short, whatever Amakusa Shiro wants, he will get it when he comes to the island. After all, as long as the war continues, the shogunate will not be able to deal with him, and it has to give him tax exemptions and exclusive product privileges. Ladeo put down his telescope and entered the noisy tavern next to him. Although this pub is opened in Japan, the tables and chairs inside are completely exotic. The tavern is full of ferocious pirates, including Japanese, Ming Dynasty people, and even Westerners and Indians. Some were extremely drunk, some were teasing the receptionist, some were beating each other, and more were gathering together and talking nonsense. These people also have a common characteristic, that is, they are not easy to mess with. Miss Flora, I don't think you can find a proud fighter here. All we saw along the way were a bunch of thieves, hooligans and pirates. The speaker was a white-haired beauty who was as tall as a man. Her tight body was wrapped in black silk cloth under black plate armor. The arrogant and somewhat harsh voice made the atmosphere in the noisy tavern quiet. Woman, pairs of greedy and hungry eyes turned towards the tall beauty, just like a pack of wolves watching for a lamb. Suck, you're really good. She's pretty, fair-skinned, has long legs, and she's a white-haired girl. A wretched dwarf swallowed his saliva and said this, which immediately caused a burst of laughter, and the atmosphere in the tavern immediately became lively. The first thoughts of the drunkards in the tavern when they saw this rare female knight were how much she was worth and how to get her, so they started to talk dirty words one after another. Hey, little girl, are you shy? It's your first time going out, right? Do you want to do it for the first time tonight? Good things come in pairs. Don't be afraid, little sister. Come to me, and I will protect you, and take you to interesting places at night. Looking at the girl's head turning white from the exhaustion caused by the long journey, the boss gives her a glass of wine, and it's on my account. If the girl wants to stay in a hotel, she can stay in my room. The white-haired beauty narrowed her eyes. Although she was often laughed at because of her status as a female knight, this was the first time she heard so many dirty words, and she couldn't help but clenched her fists. She had broken more teeth in the past few days than she had in the past 20 years, and there were several irregular dents on her gauntlets that made her very unhappy. The white-haired beauty seemed to be planning to teach the dwarf a lesson, but a fat bodyguard blocked her way. Girl, think about it, and get under me. Haha. As the fat bodyguard spoke, he stretched out his hand to hook the white-haired beauty's chin, but before he could finish his words, he was punched away. Seeing the fat bodyguard being blown away, the drinkers raised their glasses and cheered. The white-haired beauty ignored the unconscious fat man and continued to walk towards the dwarf. The dwarf couldn't help but retreat, and finally couldn't help shouting, "Fuck, no matter who it is, don't let this bitch get close to me. I'll pay you 20 gold coins." As soon as these words came out, there was a commotion in the tavern. You know, for many sailors, the reward for a voyage is only 1 gold coin. A voyage can take several months or even half a year. 20 gold coins are enough to attract these desperados. As a result, some drinkers have already pushed away the cheap waitress next to them, and some are already preparing to move around. Not only did the white-haired beauty show no fear, she was even slightly excited. The white-haired beauty knocked down the bald man behind her with one elbow, then grabbed a thin man by his hair and threw him out, knocking down 2 drinkers who were about to cause trouble. Well done, you deserve it. Who comes next? To ha. Behind the white-haired beauty, a girl wearing a large cloak took her arm. Stop it, Sophia. We are here to do business. The white-haired beauty turned back to blow the messed up hair and patted the little girl in the cloak on the head lovingly. Listen to you. Suddenly, the white-haired beauty felt that the lights seemed to dim, and at some point a tall black orc appeared behind her. The black orc's arms were thicker than her legs. The giant arms closed as fiercely as iron pincers and were unstoppable. Everyone seemed to see the cold female knight being hugged by the black orc, clawing and kicking, yelling and scolding, but to no avail. Even using his head and teeth, he couldn't stop the air from his lungs from being squeezed out bit by bit. Next, there was a sharp pain in the chest, then the stomach was churning and almost vomiting. Finally, with a muffled sound, the spine was broken, the internal organs were squeezed out, blood and gastric juice spurted out of the mouth, and the limbs hung down weakly. However, the next second, after returning to reality, the white-haired beauty kicked the black orc in the crotch. The black orc was in pain, and covered the pain with his hands, and slowly knelt down. However, Sophia did not intend to give him this opportunity, and covered the black orc's head with both hands. A flying knee hit caused the black orc to completely lose consciousness. The method was quick and cruel, and the drunkards who were eager to try it just now couldn't help but feel chills in their crotches, and they were so shaken that they almost woke up. Sophia glanced at the men in the tavern as if provocative. Very good. Lady O clapped and walked out. As the overlord of the Sea of Japan, he is a local leader. The appearance of Lady O made the whole tavern quiet. The dwarf who just offered to beat someone up is now hiding in the corner, hoping not to be discovered by Lady O. On the other hand, he secretly rejoiced in his heart. Hey, you stinky bitches. The women who are attracted to the island will end up worse than dead. That little Japan is so perverted. The white-haired beauty chose to ignore Lady O and prepared to leave with the cloaked girl. But this kind of disregard made Lady O even more excited. Woman, you have successfully attracted my attention, and now you are barely qualified to bear my child. Sophia glanced at Lejima and said something. Roll. Woman, do you know who I am? I'm a protege of His Majesty the Shogun, the chief of the Shogunate Navy, Kirishima Suzuki. As long as I say a word, you will never step out of Japan. In the entire East China Sea, no one can save you. What Lejima told is the truth. He is the absolute overlord of the Sea of Japan, and both the shogunate and the pirates will betray him. Before the white-haired beauty could reply, a young man who had been sitting in the corner drinking stood up. Not necessarily. What are you? Lady O was shocked and angry, and asked the samurai around him to get the young man. With just a flash of the sword, the young man had already arrived in front of Lady O. The long knife was placed on Lady O's neck. 2 of Lady O's men slowly fell down later. Key. Family Army. Key will be destroyed. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 567, Faith and Business. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was still very satisfied with the battle in Alsace-Lorraine. After all, the French were much weaker than he thought. As for rifled weapons such as hot air balloons, it was only a matter of time before they were discovered, as long as they were put into use. After this war is over, I'm afraid the French will carry out a wave of military reforms. If they learn their lessons, it sounds a bit magical. Prussia planned to bring Alsace-Lorraine, the French, to join the German customs union, but it was vetoed by Hanover. The British, although the Austrian Empire did not calm down throughout 1844 and was constantly involved in disputes, its economic growth did not slow down, but showed leapfrog growth. Industry finally surpassed agriculture, and the annual fiscal revenue is expected to exceed the half-billion florin mark. It's hard to imagine that just 10 years ago this country's industrial output was only 1/10 that of agriculture, but now industry has overwhelmed agricultural output, and continues to do so. 10 years ago, the country's fiscal revenue exceeded 100 million florins. The income of state civil servants has not increased in more than 30 years, but in the past 10 years, their wages have increased 12 times, which is 2.25 times the previous level. In the past, soldiers not only had the lowest job, but also had no guarantee of life. No matter how brave they were, the final outcome was just blood and tears. Now these people are regarded as heroes, and receive the treatment they deserve, even after leaving the army. It is also possible to support oneself. The salary of soldiers at that time was very low. Even if France improved a lot, it was difficult for most of them to be associated with wealth. You can refer to the current situation of future generations of veterans who have served less than 20 years in the US military. These people have no pensions, no medical insurance, and can only receive a subsidy that is enough for 2 to 5 years of expenses. A significant number of them are unable to support themselves. They were the main source of vagrants and gangsters in society at that time. The journey from the northernmost tip of Bohemia to Dalmatia, which once took 100 days, can now be completed in just 1 day by train. It takes half a year to get from the northernmost tip of the Po River plain to the mountains of Transylvania, but only 40 hours at this time. In October he finally published the famous long poem The Weaver's Song of Silesia. There are no tears in melancholy eyes. They sat at the loom and gritted their teeth. Germany, we weave your shroud. We weave in a triple curse. We weave. One curse curses God. We prayed to him when we were hungry and cold. Hope and expectation are in vain, but was teased, and deceived by him. We weave. A curse for the rich king. He cares nothing for our pain. He scratched off our few cents. Shoot us like dogs. We weave. A curse to the hypocritical motherland Germany. There is shamelessness and depravity everywhere. The good flowers are picked early. The moldy garbage is full of maggots. We weave. The shuttle seems to be flying. The loom creaks. We weave non-stop. And we are so nervous day and night. Old Germany, weave your shroud. We have woven in a triple curse. We weave. Although informed people knew that he was criticizing Prussia, the German Confederation received an additional 100 critical hits then, driven by Prussia. This famous long poem fell out of favor in Germany, but became popular in the defeated France. Although he himself was extremely reluctant, Louis-Philippe cordially received this citizen of Paris, and called him a model of French artists. Franz couldn't help but began to worry about the IQ of His Majesty the King, who had an additional identity due to the Alsace-Lorraine incident. That is, the German Duke of Alsace-Lorraine. The refugees from Silesia had a new home in Austria. Most of them found new jobs and started a new life. Of course, some of them were buried in this new land, or became their burial grounds. Priests. Some of these people were indeed not qualified for most jobs in the Austrian Empire due to their physical condition and learning abilities. But it is still possible to become a low-level missionary, to save more people like them. In short, the work of these people is promotion and intermediary. The reason why Franz is able to control the church so firmly is not just as simple as the archbishop's personal recognition of being a born saint. Relationships always require the maintenance of interests. For example, the church's most important Holy Glory Company and Purified Water Company are industries that cooperate with Franz. I've written about it before, so I won't go into details here. In fact, one of the two companies sells bleaching powder, while the other sells medical alcohol. Although they appear to be two low-end industries, in fact these two companies have contributed more to Austria's public health and medical services than all doctors in Austria, and the income they create is self-evident. Bleaching powder and the new habit of drinking hot water reduced waterborne infectious diseases by 95%. Cholera, dysentery, hepatitis A, hepatitis E, dracunculiasis, typhoid, acute diarrhea, tapeworm, cysticercosis. These infectious diseases that frequently broke out in European large cities at this time were extremely rare in the large cities of the Austrian Empire. During the same period, there were many large-scale plague outbreaks in London and Paris, especially the former, which had multiple cholera outbreaks in 1844. As for why there is no Berlin? Because Berlin was not a big city at that time. In 1844, Berlin's population was only over 200,000, which was less than a fraction of London's population. At the same time, due to the compulsory promotion of medical alcohol hand washing, the surgical mortality rate in the Austrian Empire dropped off a cliff. The number of patients who had to have their limbs amputated due to postoperative infection was greatly reduced. At the same time, the neonatal and maternal mortality rates were also much lower than in other European countries. Moreover, with the application of sanitary conditions and anesthetic gases, medicine in the Austrian Empire has also developed by leaps and bounds, especially in the field of surgery, which has completely reached a height that other countries cannot reach at this time. These achievements come from those inconspicuous gadgets and the efforts of inconspicuous little people. However, these achievements are not enough. The remote cities of the Austrian Empire are still so backward that they need someone to promote these things and popularize this knowledge. And no one is more suitable than these priests with firm beliefs. As long as they believe that they are doing the right thing, and let them see the achievements they have made. After all, there is nothing more powerful than believing that what they are doing is right. Convincing. These people are not afraid of any risks, obstacles, or even the cold eyes of the world, and can even be self-motivated, self-enchanted, and self-evolved. Of course, in addition to bleaching powder and medical alcohol, Franz also has a lot of new gadgets, such as toothpaste, toothbrushes, soap in the modern sense, as well as modern hygiene knowledge and anti-fraud knowledge. As long as the stubbornness of these people is used in the right place, it can also play a role in promoting history. In addition to selling products, promoting common sense, and spreading the idea of loyalty to the emperor and patriotism, these people can also shoulder the responsibilities of neighborhood committee aunts, such as supervision, reporting, preaching, collecting intelligence, coordinating neighbor relations, etc. The most important thing should be to help new immigrants better adapt to life in the Austrian Empire, and at the same time, help them find their right place and completely integrate into the Austrian Empire. At the same time, church organizations are also expanding, such as alms halls at train stations, missionary stations abroad, etc. In particular, it would be more convincing to let these once most useless people receive the desperate new immigrants. Chapter 568 Paper. Belgrade, number 1 Royal Paper Products Factory. This is Franz's most solid backing when fighting a public opinion war, and it can also be regarded as a gift from the Austrian Empire to this city. Due to the existence of the Royal Paper Mill, a large number of related industries developed around it, thus creating a large number of jobs, and the locals also lived a prosperous life. The most important reason why Franz chose this place was not the convenient transportation, cheap raw materials, or cheap local labor, but that it was far enough away from Vienna, and on the lower reaches of the Danube River. In fact, very few countries exported paper to foreign countries in this era, because all countries had very low paper-making capabilities, and could hardly meet their own domestic needs. But at the same time, there is a strange phenomenon, that is, the market's desire to buy is also very low. Even the United Kingdom, the country with the highest paper production in the world at this time, rarely exports paper. Historically, the British paper production in 1844 was 200,000 tons, and the export volume was only 10,000 tons. The French paper production was 110,000 tons, the United States was 11,000 tons, Prussia was 6,000 tons, and the huge Austrian Empire was only a pitiful 0.4 thousandths of tons. In fact, this historical phenomenon is caused by different processes. The traditional paper-making industry in Europe still uses circular wire paper-making machines, while Britain and France have adopted more advanced forged linear wire paper-making machines, and the United States is, because the paper-making industry has just started. Forged linear wire paper-making itself is more suitable for large-scale production than rotary wire paper-making, but what really enabled the large-scale development of the paper-making industry was the development of chemical pulping technology. Franz didn't know the specific process of this technology, but he knew that caustic soda, sodium hydroxide, was needed. In fact, the scientific name of this pulping method is caustic soda pulping. The process is basically the same as the modern common sulfate method, but caustic soda solution is used for cooking, and sodium carbonate, or caustic soda, is used in the alkali recovery system to supplement the loss of alkali during the production process. This method is commonly used to cook hardwood and non-wood plant fiber or materials. The quality of the resulting pulp is close to that of sulfate pulp, but it is still a very big improvement for the paper-making industry at this time point. Historically, this method was invented by the British in 1851, but with the support of Franz's financial resources and prophecy, a few unknown chemists tinkered with it. After all, even the caustic soda and steam are ready. If these people can't get it out, they will be worse than pigs due to the application of the Fordrinia paper machine and the caustic soda pulping method. The paper output of the Austrian Empire had reached 130,000 tons at this time, surpassing France to become the second in the world and the first in Europe. At this time, Austria's paper was not only self-sufficient, but also used to seize the international market. Its most important trading partners were Russia and the Ottomans. Franz actually liked the feeling of importing wood from Russia and the Ottomans at low prices, and then selling paper to them at high prices, to make a profit. After all, this will not only recover costs, but also promote the development of the country's economy. In fact, what was returned to them was not only paper, but also a large amount of wastewater. Although it was a bit bad, it was still a bit cool. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. In addition, Franz also did some market research and found that the demand for paper products in the market is single, and 70% of paper is used for newspaper and book printing. Government office paper only accounts for 2% of the total demand, and the rest is paper for account books, educational paper, writing paper, and other uses. Toilet paper, packaging paper. Although Franz only felt that he had done an insignificant thing, it shocked Kagura and Ajani. Especially Kagura's mouth seemed to be able to fit an egg, so Franz peeled one off and stuffed it in, making the former dance and roll his eyes. Don't show your emotions, that will become your weakness. Even in this situation, Franz did not forget to teach the envoy who was about to set off. Kagura immediately knelt down and leaned over and answered neatly, "Yes, you are clearly teasing others, but you still say it so seriously." Ajani kept complaining in her heart. She was confused by this Eastern model and rolled her eyes at Franz to express that she would never kneel on the ground and do that kind of thing. But I still think what Franz did is incredible. After all, there was no concept of market research at the time, let alone proposing changes to the market, product structure, etc. It was simply unbelievable. Franz is very clear that in the future, newspaper will far exceed the paper used for printing books, and cheap paper specially used for printing newspapers will occupy half of the paper products market. In fact, until the 1980s, newsprint accounted for half of the paper products market in major European and American countries. Moreover, the paper product market will continue to expand in the future, including packaging and daily life paper product markets, which will appear and continue to expand. So Franz knew very well that the 130,000 tons at this time was not a number to be proud of. On the contrary, it was too little. Franz's plan is to double the company's growth in 1 year. Ajani would definitely sneer at such words if spoken to others, but she didn't dare to underestimate the young man in front of her. After all, in the past 3 years, she had witnessed how the Austrian Empire's paper production increased 30-fold. Ajani joked, "Just double? Don't you think it's too little? It's not like what you said, the market can't digest it, so what's the use of having so much?" Franz asked rhetorically. Although human demand for paper is increasing rapidly with the development of society, thinking inertia and consumption habits are not so easy to change. And paper is a commodity after all. Once the supply exceeds demand, the price will drop, leading to a series of problems. Franz is still more willing to enjoy the market dividends for a while. At the same time, in order to ensure that Austrian paper is sufficiently competitive, it must also maintain technological leadership. The Royal Society of Science has invested millions of florins in development funds for this purpose. Where did this money come from? Of course it's the market. Only in this way can a virtuous cycle be formed. Otherwise, even if Franz hollows out all the gold mines in the world, there will be a day when the holes cannot be filled. Point of course, those millions of florins cannot all be used to develop paper-making technology. After all, the times are limited, and some things cannot be done. Instead of wasting resources on useless efforts, it is better to develop new products instead. Franz is interested in the packaging paper market, toilet paper market, and corrugated paper market, as well as the letter paper market, which is the most fiercely contested. In fact, historically, Austria's paper industry was mainly concentrated in the high-end paper market. After all, this is the most profitable. However, with the development of the times, the amount of paper used has increased dramatically, and traditional handcrafts cannot keep up with the development of the industrial era. This led to the overall backwardness of the Austrian paper industry. Franz does not intend to obliterate all traditional craftsmanship. He will acquire those traditional technologies through acquisitions, cooperation, etc., try to industrialize them, or turn some of the valuable ones into real luxury goods. As for the dross among them, Franz will directly write those technologies into a book, and then throw them into the torrent of history. Chapter 569. After the war. London, England. Robert Peel had high expectations for this sudden war. After all, the French had suffered a heavy loss to Austria in North America. At this time, the two sides must be extremely jealous of each other's enemies. It would be best for Britain to fight without distinction for a year and a half. This would be most beneficial to Britain. It's just that everything happened so suddenly and ended so quickly that the diplomatic order that had just been sent had to be urgently recalled. Starting a war, armistice, starting a war, negotiating peace, and withdrawing troops. This series of intensive operations made the British unable to keep up. Although they had all the advantages, the coalition did not pursue the victory. And the conditions offered were incredibly loose. If the French had not committed suicide themselves, I'm afraid that this war would have caused almost no harm to the two countries. Robert Peel thought that the French's approach would anger the coalition forces. He even prepared to give a speech in Congress, calling for support for France in maintaining the balance of power on the European continent. However, France and Germany reached an agreement quickly, which caught Robert Peel off guard for a while. The final compensation of 30 million francs agreed upon by both parties shocked the British. After all, this figure was only a drop in the bucket for France at this time. Not to mention broken muscles and bones. I'm afraid it's not even a scratch. Regarding the handling of the compensation, Franz's suggestion to Metternich was to distribute it to the locals of Alsace-Lorraine who suffered hardships, with 1/3 used for compensation and the remaining 2/3 used for construction funds, although nationalism is now prevalent in Germany. Franz does not believe that the consciousness of these people will suddenly become higher. However, if there are material rewards, it will be different. The soldiers will naturally be motivated to work. As for those small countries, they also need to be appeased. After all, they provide money and efforts. Franz will take out 15 million florins, approximately 30 million francs, and let those countries distribute it among themselves. Metternich naturally had no objection to this. After all, doing so would increase the prestige of the Austrian Empire. As for how Archduke Franz wanted to spend his own money, he would not interfere. Since the Austrian Empire did not explain its principles, these states fought openly and covertly for the money, and even big countries like Prussia and Bavaria were not immune from it. It's actually interesting to see these people dividing the pie. The small countries want to divide it equally, the big countries want to divide it according to their territory, and Prussia, which sends the most troops, wants to divide it according to the number of troops it sends. Although Prussia sent 50,000 troops, the largest number of countries except Austria, 150,000, they remained stationary by the Saar River and did not directly participate in the subsequent battles. Baden sent 30,000 troops and suffered the most casualties among the coalition forces except Austria, so they felt that they should be distributed according to battle losses and participation rate. Of course, there are many proposals. For example, according to the cost of the war, Ludwig I of Bavaria claimed that he spent 100 million florins on this war. In fact, everyone knows that His Majesty the King must have run out of money to pick up girls, so he would say such outrageous things normally no one would expose him, but this matter involves the interests of all countries, and no one will show mercy. As a result, the scandal of Ludwig I was spread in various ways, which greatly damaged the image of the Bavarian royal family. This fight for compensation is not over yet. The top leaders of the Confederacy who had previously shared the same hatred have turned into competitors. No one cares about the lives of the people below. At this time, Franz proposed that he could undertake the medical work of all coalition soldiers, and they could go to the Austrian Empire for treatment with just a train ticket. This is good news for the soldiers. After all, they all know that the medical level of the Austrian Empire is the best in Europe. Doctors will not chop off people's hands and feet easily. Even if they want to chop people's hands and feet, they will anesthetize them first, unlike other countries. Also uses moves such as the 24-second supreme sharp knife and the 5-shot lightning saw. The most important parameter for evaluating surgeons at that time was hand speed. In addition, Franz also built a Confederate veterans home. Although it has the word home, it should actually be regarded as an agency. The other end was naturally connected to Colonial and Umbrella Security Company. After the end of the Mexican-American War, Mexico was in chaos like every place where the US military had fought. The US military left a lot of equipment behind before leaving and transported a lot of weapons to northern Mexico through France. As a result, there are 4 presidents and more than a dozen generals in the entire Mexico, except for the land controlled by the Mexico Development Company. Almost everywhere there are rebels, civil strife must be dealt with, but at this time Tazanana did not have enough troops. The Black Legion could barely make up a regiment, and Jimmy's cavalry still had more than 3,000 people left. There are quite a few security forces in Rouville, but most of them are the private soldiers of the big families who have taken refuge in Tazanana and the citizens of the city. This group of people has no problem defending their property in the city. But it is difficult to expect them to serve the country. Unless the money is in place, they can fight faster than a horse. However, Tazanana has calculated an account. Instead of using this group of money-minded guys, it would be more economical to directly ask Umbrella Company to do the work. Although Franz has repeatedly claimed that Umbrella Company is a borderless organization, everyone knows that this is a legal mercenary group created by the Austrian Empire. In fact, during this period, European countries began to oppose mercenaries. The liberals of Switzerland, a former mercenary country, had formulated a constitution against mercenaries. Although it was rejected by the Orthodox faction, it gave the country's mercenary industry a heavy blow. At the same time, Montenegro, a traditional mercenary power in Eastern Europe, joined the Austrian Empire, which directly put the entire industry into a cold winter. Fortunately, France's Umbrella Company has taken over their ecological niche and provided various services needed by various countries. Mexico and Brazil are Umbrella's 2 largest customers at this time, especially the former, who is ready to further expand cooperation. After the US-Mexico War, Tazanana's attitude towards the rebels also changed. After all, he had come to power through a coup before, and he wanted to become the savior of Mexico and the Napoleon of North America. But after experiencing a large-scale rebellion during the Mexican-American War, and seeing the true attitude of soldiers and people towards the rebels, he decided to eradicate them. So Tazanana personally led his own troops and Umbrella's mercenaries to start a bloody road to counter the rebellion. The rebels were driven out wherever they went, and then a strict household registration system was established to prevent these rebels from contacting each other. At the same time, local resources and development matters were handed over to employees of the United Development Company. Tazanana wanted to remake Mexico into an impregnable fortress, so that he could reclaim lost land from the Americans and French. Instigated by the Mexican newspaper Gloria and other media founded by Franz, Tazanana accepted the title of Savior of the Nation awarded by the Congress, and became the real dictator of Mexico. Chapter 570. After the war, Franz still likes people like Tazanana. After all, this kind of guy has a self-awareness of being a benevolent king. On the contrary, Juan Pablo Duarte, the former president of Dominica, has overestimated his capabilities. First, He held democratic elections to dilute his power, and then he was directly driven out of Dominica by Pedro Santana's coup. Franz spent a lot of effort to get the former Dominican president to Austria, but the latter actually wanted Austria to send troops to help him suppress the rebellion. Franz sent someone to tell him that the time had not come yet and to be patient. In exchange, Juan Pablo Duarte escaped overnight. Franz didn't know how this guy escaped from Vienna, or how he escaped from Austria to France. But even thinking about it with his buttocks, the French hands had already reached into Vienna and even reached Franz's side. It's just that Duarte is far less important than the French spy thought, especially since the former Dominican president was unwilling to even agree to some of the small additional conditions proposed by Louis Philippe. This made the head of the Orleans dynasty very dissatisfied, but what made him even more unexpected was that Duarte dared to urge France to send troops as soon as possible. At this time, Marshal Soult's cabinet firmly opposed Louis Philippe's plan to return to Haiti. In the eyes of these veterans who had experienced the Haitian Independence War, this behavior was seeking death. There are two countries on the island of Haiti, one is Haiti and the other is Dominica. I have mentioned them before, so I won't go into details here. You must know that Haiti once defeated three powerful colonial powers, Spain, Britain, and France, killed hundreds of thousands of white people, and then enslaved the white country. No major power dared to look down upon him. The French cabinet even suspected that Austria had deliberately released this person. After all, they had not received any news that the Austrians were preparing to attack Haiti. Although Duarte's reputation is not low, no politician wants to make a deal with such a fool. Not to mention that Pedro Santana had already sent people to contact France, hoping to use the latter's power to fight Haiti. One has a false reputation, and the other holds great power. Everyone knows how to choose, but the country of Dominica is really not worth such a large investment. If France loses another 35,000 troops in Haiti, I'm afraid Prime Minister Sert can retire early. After all, the previous Luxembourg crisis and Alsace-Lorraine incident have already discredited him. The first time, Jane Durden Gizzard took the blame. Last time, Grouchy took the blame. Who will take the blame next time? Who has this weight? His Majesty the King is a non-stick pan. He is the first citizen of France and a moral model, so he is the only one left who is an antique from the Napoleonic era. Not only did the Prime Minister object, but the Finance Minister also held up the deficit statement. France now needs too much money, and the Battle of Alsace-Lorraine stimulated the military. War Minister Alexander Morin demanded that a series of military research projects be put into effect immediately, as well as a comprehensive update of equipment and a continued increase in the number of standing troops. Otherwise he would not be able to guarantee France's security. Historically, Alexander Morin came to power in 1845, but at this time France was developing much faster than in history. Soult was old and had too many things to do, so he could not preside over the army reform and had to give way. For young people, at this time, France's standing army ranked first in Europe, with 620,000, equivalent to the sum of the two great powers of Prussia and Austria, and with it came outrageous expenses. The French Navy has 1,000 ships transporting soldiers and supplies to the colonies alone. In addition, they often fight tough battles, and this consumption will increase exponentially. France's military expenditure is now the largest in Europe. In addition, the Minister of Transport was also greatly stimulated. After visiting the UK and the German region, he sadly discovered that what the Germans said was true. The speed of French trains has lagged behind. Although it is faster than the Spaniards who travel at 20 km per hour, it is not enough to make the Gallic chickens proud. Moreover, France was defeated in its mobilization ability in both conflicts with the German Confederation. The military also supported the Secretary of Transportation's railway reform plan, but the money required to invest was astronomical. Louis Philippe was so annoyed by this group of people asking for money that he simply chose to leave. The remaining navy and colonial ministers could only ask Soult for money. The latter have no choice but to find a solution to the financial consortium. But these people are bankers, not philanthropists, and they are not interested in investments that do not know when the cost will be recovered. At the same time, there is another point, that is, they cannot raise so much money because their counterparts in the German region are busy investing in their own countries historically. French bankers borrowed money from the German region to develop France. The frugal money of the nobles of the Austrian Empire was also invested in France, which was why it was able to develop so rapidly. France mainly relied on technological innovation to develop the Austrian economy, but financiers were not fools. When they saw that there was money to be made, they would naturally try their best to participate. Of course, there are also some who plan to find another way. France has killed several batches, and thanks to their money, the Austrian economy can develop more rapidly and steadily. It could not see King Louis Philippe and Prime Minister Soult for many days, and he felt that these people were avoiding him. Then it decided to ignore the guards, and found the right moment to stop Louis Philippe's car. Louis Philippe, who was in the carriage, had just received news from Vienna that the intelligence system that had cost millions of francs to build had been uprooted by the Austrians. He was in anger when the carriage suddenly stopped. Since Louis Philippe did not like Austrian goods, his carriage still had wooden tires, and no new shock absorbers were installed, causing his forehead to hit directly in front of him on the seat. Louis Philippe climbed out of the carriage in embarrassment, and was furious when he saw it. What do you want to do? I have been treating you like a distinguished guest, and look what you have done. Although Louis Philippe was very angry, his tone and words were relatively mild. This gave it the illusion that the other party was not a serious concern, and that his own country's affairs were more important. Your Majesty the King, I have considered the suggestions you gave me. I think the Dominican Republic can reduce the 1% tariff on French goods, but you should immediately send troops to help my people regain democracy and justice, and eliminate that potential threat. No, sir, France will not fight a war thousands of kilometers away for a 1% tariff reduction, let alone sacrifice the precious lives of French soldiers for this. Please come back. I don't want to see you again. Your justice is only your personal justice. I don't think the people of Dominica will recognize your civil war behavior. Louis Philippe really couldn't bear it anymore. He had never seen anyone stingier than himself. Louis Philippe returned to the car holding his forehead, leaving it alone and messy in the wind. Chapter 571 Projector. Because the photography industry in Austria has developed so rapidly, it has also led to the development of other technologies. Euhardius, an instructor at the Austrian Artillery Academy, accidentally combined slides and stampful discs while researching new teaching methods, and created the earliest projector. The artillery major did not use his invention for teaching, nor did he declare it as an invention. Instead, he used it to pick up girls. Yes, Euhardius and his invention became the focus of major balls and frequent guests in high society salons. Franz almost never goes to balls or salons. One reason is his personality. He feels that he still has many important things to do, and the chaotic atmosphere is not suitable for him. Another reason is that Mrs. Sophie feels that those balls are a complete waste of time, just like those professors' courses. What the Austrian Empire needs is a king, not a scholar or a social master. In fact, Mrs. Sophie was quite resentful towards her father and brother. If 2 consecutive generations of kings had not indulged in female sex, Bavaria would not be what it is today. They have more love affairs than the memorials they have approved. They can't get on the stage, or get out of bed. They are just like 2 bores, especially for Ludwig's mistress at this time, Laura Munster. Also translated as Laura Mons, Madame Sophie. She was even more contemptuous. Lola Munster initially thought of herself as a gypsy dancer, but soon became a social butterfly in the French upper class. She eloped with people several times because of love, but in the end she was always abandoned by scumbags. She learned from the pain, and decided not to be a doll for others to play with, and then Lola Munster began her evil life. The first target chosen by Lola Munster was Alexander de Guerry, a well-known newspaper owner and art critic in Paris at the time. Lola Munster was very scheming. She collected a lot of personal information about Alexander de Guerry, understood all aspects of him, and discovered that one of the characteristics of the latter was that he passed a horse farm every day. Equestrian happened to be one of Lola Munster's specialties, so the two had a wonderful encounter. Although it was an old-fashioned hero saving a beauty, it deeply touched de Guerry's heart. Later, in order to express her gratitude, Laura invited de Guerry to drink a cup of coffee in a very ordinary cafe on the side of the road. Through the unintentional conversation between the two, the latter felt the taste of love. The two end up spending a romantic evening, and soon after Lola moves into Dugary's villa point. The two made love at a high society banquet, which made Dugary's friends shout that it was impossible. After all, this veteran in love had always had a one-night stand, and the word loyalty would never appear in this man point, so some people began to bet on how long it would take for Dugary to get tired of playing this time. But what was surprising was that not long after, Dugary announced that he was going to marry Lola Munster. However, the good times did not last long, and Dugary soon died in a duel with a critic who had insulted Lola Munster in the newspaper. After that, Laura Munster had to leave Paris, and she moved to Munich, the capital of Bavaria. This time Lola Munster targeted King Ludwig I of Bavaria. It's just that it's much harder to get close to the king than to get close to a newspaper owner. But this doesn't trouble Lola Munster. She first caused an encounter and became the lover of Count Huntenberg, the chamberlain of Ludwig I. Later, under the latter's arrangement, he got an opportunity to meet the king. But he happened to be caught by the queen. No woman would want such a charming bitch to be around her husband, so she ordered the soldiers to drive him away. But the latter tore off the clothes on his chest and pushed the soldier away while he was stunned and broke into King Ludwig I's room. Then Lola Munster began her performance in full view of the public. This overly explicit performance made the nobles and ministers present shout obscene, but Lola Munster captured Ludwig I in the shortest time. The latter favored the former, gave her many gifts, and even wrote poems for her. But the most outrageous thing was that Ludwig I even allowed Lola Munster to get involved in government affairs and participate in national affairs. He also gave the latter the title of countess, making her a person more powerful than 10,000 people. You must know that the status of women at that time was not high. As a princess, Lady Sophie had no power to involve politics, although she theoretically does not have it now. Mrs. Sophie did not want her eldest son to one day become as virtuous as her father and brother, so on the one hand, Mrs. Sophie did not want Franz to get too involved in useless things. On the other hand, he is collecting talents everywhere. To make Franz completely immune to such people closer to home, Jenny plans to give Franz a surprise. So the former took the latter to her room, closed the doors and windows, closed the heavy curtains, and began to extinguish the candles one by one. Miss Jenny, I think I'm still young. Maybe we can chat first. Franz seemed a little shy and a little hopeful. Only then did Jenny realize that what she was doing was easily misunderstood. In fact, she had lived the same life as an these years. Although she was a little uncomfortable at first, as time went by and more things happened, she became accustomed to it. Once you get used to it, you feel like you are getting younger as you live. Occasionally, when Jenny gets up in the morning and enters the Grand Duke's room, she will see the bulge on the quilt and occasionally tease it. She likes the ambiguous feeling now. As for whether there will be further development, she doesn't know. But now Jenny doesn't want to do this. She just wants to show off her new toy. Jenny hit Franz on the head. What are you thinking about? Let you see something good, Franz. What? So mysterious, Jenny. Extinguished the last candle, leaving the whole room shrouded in darkness, and then suddenly a beam of light appeared on the curtains, and then an image appeared, which seemed to be a person carrying a cannonball. As Jenny turned something like a disc lying horizontally, the screen began to move. The picture is simple and blurry, lasting only a dozen seconds. Naturally, this primitive projection technology could not surprise Franz. But seeing that he was still interested, he simply cooperated. While applauding, he said, not bad, not bad. Franz's perfunctory behavior was discovered by Jenny. You don't seem surprised at all, Franz. Well, isn't this the slide projector? Wasn't it invented in the 16th century, Jenny? No, the slide projector can only project images, not make them move, Franz. Actually, as long as it can switch 24 pictures per second, it can be moved. The limitations of the stampful disk are too strong, and the picture can only be maintained for 30 seconds at most. It's just that this early company no projector can compare. Projector? Jenny interrupted. Franz quickly explained, a brand new tool that allows screen time to break through the limitations of the stampful disk. In the future, it should also lead to a brand new industry and a means of threatening people. Are you interested? Be a movie heroine? Chapter 572 Steam Rotary Printing Press. Franz's words could not impress the other party at all. After all, the actor's status at this time was far less than that of later generations. Even the top stars of Dark Moon and Sunlight, the two most popular theaters in Vienna at this time, may not necessarily have a high social status. In the eyes of truly powerful people, they are nothing more than high-end prostitutes. As Franz's attendant, Jenny had only half a foot in the empire's inner circle, and her status was much higher than that of ordinary counts and duchess. Franz sometimes even suspected that the Austrian Empire's talent points were chosen randomly. They were really talented in eating, drinking, playing, and having fun. Franz just proposed the most basic concept of a projector. Experts from the Royal Scientific Society used existing technologies such as film to create a disc projector and broke through the shackles of the stampful disc. However, there were a new problem: is that film is difficult to recycle. So Franz once again proposed the concept of film supply cassette and film collection cassette. At this time, the projector had begun to take shape, but the transmission of film was still inconvenient. Franz remembered that when he used PS to modify old pictures, there were neat holes on both sides of the film, so he proposed that neat holes should be punched on both sides to facilitate transmission. Although it is only a small change, it solves the big problem of gear transmission and also provides a stable frame rate standard for the projector. The result was not only a hand-cranked projector, but also the earliest point-and-shoot camera. Franz then established the first projection company in the Austrian Empire, but this time he did not promote it with great fanfare, but planned to use it as a means of propaganda and education. Franz plans to save this technology for the World Expo a few years later, when it will be a blockbuster and the effect will be even better. The emergence of projectors will change traditional training models, especially in military and vocational education. After all, neither the so-called master nor the manual is as intuitive and selfless as the projector. Franz felt that the emergence of this equipment would greatly improve the efficiency and cost of training, which would mean more soldiers and craftsmen for the Austrian Empire. At the same time, it will also affect the model of national propaganda. For example, Franz's minstrel project may become a screen team in the future. But it doesn't matter. After all, the wheel of history always moves forward. It's just a matter of sooner or later. But with only images and no sound, wouldn't it become a mime? Franz had considered the problem of the gramophone, but unfortunately he didn't get what he wanted this time. One was because the front-end technology was too different, and the other was that Franz couldn't give effective suggestions. After all, he had seen and disassembled old-fashioned projectors, and even bought models and assembled them. But he had only seen phonographs in movies, and the only principle he knew was related to sound vibration. Obviously, this alone could not speed up the pace of scientific and technological progress. In fact, during the previous propaganda war with France, in addition to a large amount of cheap paper, the printing technology of the Austrian Empire also overwhelmed the form. Of the mid-19th century was a very magical era. With the invention of movable typecasting machines and typesetting machines, wooden printing presses, iron printing presses, and steam printing presses appeared at the same time, each showing its magical powers. Wood is the slowest, but has a low threshold for cheap technology. It has a long history, and is the most commonly used printing technology in North Germany. Iron printing presses were faster, more durable, and came in more styles. They could be either press type or arm type. The French and Americans were particularly fond of this type of printing press. Next came the result of the Industrial Revolution, the steam printing press, which also changed the source of power on the basis of the former. It could print 2,000 sheets per hour, which was 4 times the speed of the iron printing press. Only one such machine was needed, and it could be completed in half a day. The Times, the world's largest circulation newspaper at the time, had a daily circulation, 23,000 copies. However, for timeliness, the newspaper has 4 such machines. Austria adopted a new printing method, rotary printing, which is still used today. In fact, this printing method had been tried as early as the French Revolution, but it failed due to the technical conditions at the time. Afterwards, the Norwegians and Danes also tried. The latter almost succeeded, but had to give up due to lack of funds. Finally, it was invented by the Americans in 1846. Franz was not short of money, so he simply bought the Norwegian and Danish patents, and with the help of outstanding craftsmen and engineers, he developed it in just a few months. After several years of improvement, at that time, a steam rotary printing press could print 20,000 sheets per hour. Therefore, the textbooks and brochures sent to Alsace-Lorraine were printed in only 2 days. At this time in history, Austria still used the same traditional woodblock printing technology as the German region. This was not entirely because these people were conservative and backward, but mainly because there was not enough demand. Putting aside the fact that the Austrian Empire has the second lowest literacy rate in Europe, the annual circulation of 9 million copies is very depressing. There are only 58 officially registered newspapers in the country. In fact, due to the censorship system, opening a newspaper in Austria requires a license, and many contents cannot be written. Then a large number of tabloids, the so-called black workshops, were created. At this time, the sales volume of Austrian newspapers was very poor. The largest one only had about 2,000 copies per day, and the average newspaper sales volume was only a few hundred copies per day. In contrast, the French newspaper industry is much stronger, with a circulation of about 25 million copies a year. The daily sales of the French newspaper leader La Patria have exceeded 10,000. But this is just a drop in the bucket, compared to the British. In 1844, the circulation of British newspapers was 300 million copies, of which well-known newspapers such as The Times, Morning Post, and The Sun had daily circulations of more than 20,000. In particular, the daily circulation of The Times exceeds 60,000 copies, and the annual circulation exceeds the sum of all newspapers in the Austrian Empire. As for the Americans, they were even more exaggerated. They published 500 million newspapers in 1 year in 1844, but their newspapers were not as vital as British and French newspapers. The most famous Akron Condor at the time, Liberty Magazine, New York Commercial Advertiser, Flash have all disappeared in the long river of history. Looking at the comparison of newspaper circulation, France finally understood why the Anglo-Saxons liked to compete for the hegemony of public opinion so much. Of course, the Austrian Empire was not without its merits. Its color printing, especially woodblock color printing technology, ranked first in the world. Later, the most widely used slate color printing in the 19th century was also invented by the Austrians. However, these two technologies had neither patent protection nor strong industrial support, so in the end they did not create much benefit for the Austrian Empire. But things are different now. With Franz's involvement, Austria's newspaper industry is developing rapidly. Although it is not as fast as Britain and the United States, it has successfully surpassed its old rival France. The annual circulation of 40 million is more than 4 times that of the same period in history. In addition, France did not intend to waste the original advantages of the Austrian Empire. Since they like to engage in luxury goods, why not engage in magazines? Chapter 573 Franz's pastime. Since he wanted to start a magazine, Franz decided to rush to register names such as Nature, Science, The Lancet, Time, Fortune, and Playboy. It feels that, if it has an advantage, it should make good use of it. Anyway, instant messaging in this era is very difficult, so it simply focuses on high quality products, color printing weekly, monthly, quarterly, and semi-annual magazines to seize the high-end market. Franz knows very well that it is not the newspapers that have real international influence, but these journals and magazines. They will be the embodiment of a country's soft power in the future. These things will directly affect the elites of other countries, and their influence will be immeasurably large. Of course, after publishing so many journals at once, Franz was still a little overwhelmed. This was not a matter of money, but that not all Austrian scientists were good at writing papers, and there were many practitioners among them. However, publishing an article cannot be forced, and Franz will still respect scientists' own ideas. As for the release language being only German, this matter is not negotiable. This is not to win over the Germans, but to establish the official language of Austria. Otherwise, if there are 8 languages in one book, no one except linguists will be able to understand it. At the same time, this is also to attract top talents from various countries to learn German. After all, Translators do not necessarily have professional knowledge, and a few minor ambiguities may lead to a disaster. Therefore, those people have to learn German in order to further their studies. This also improves their international influence. A waypoint, of course, this is just a preparation for harvesting. Once authority is achieved, it will be like a high mountain or a hollow valley. The world is surrounded by clouds and mist without intending to be there. It is also like a black hole that gathers without intending, but absorbs all things. This is the so-called academic hegemony point. However, at home, Franz will continue to oppose the emergence of academic circles, and at the same time, encourage scholars to challenge authority and the impossible point. Avogadro's research results were published in the first editions of Nature and Science. Although these theories have become common knowledge in Austria, they are still an unaccepted view in the world. Among them, the strongest opposition was from the British. Because Dalton, the father of modern chemistry, the absolute authority among scientists at the time, opposed Avogadro, and the former had just passed away in July 1844, the British felt that this was even more important. It is an insult to the deceased. Scientists from the Royal Society of Science even jointly stated that they would never accept Avogadro's theory, but Franz only regarded these people as farts. The reaction of the French was equally fierce. They did not recognize Avogadro's theory for the same reason as the British, because the authorities did not agree with it, and Austrian journals were obviously not authoritative. Reaction in Germany was mixed, but some echoed the sentiment after traveling to Vienna to participate in the debate. However, Avogadro's theory has indeed promoted the progress of molecular physics and molecular chemistry, which is specifically reflected in materials. Medicine, biology, energy, catering, military, almost all industries will be affected, which is a real big step. It's just that under the catalysis of Franz, the time for its recognition was advanced 20 years, which can save a lot of details. Historically, Liebig's theories laid the foundation for the chemical fertilizer industry, but it was the British who took the lead in making breakthroughs in the field of chemical fertilizers. In 1841, British Rolls invented superphosphate, which was obtained by processing natural calcium phosphate. In 1842, Britain established the world's first fertilizer factory. In 1854, Britain first produced phosphate fertilizer. However, with Franz's strong support at this time, Austria's fertilizer industry was much stronger than in history, but the quality and production efficiency did not have obvious advantages compared with the United Kingdom. Franz considered making nitrogen fertilizer, which would first require separating nitrogen from the air. This was the ultimate solution in history, and was much more reasonable and cost effective than other methods. But now there is a problem. The boiling point of oxygen, the temperature at which a liquid boils into a gas, is -183 deg.C, while the boiling point of nitrogen is -196 deg.C. To separate nitrogen, a temperature of at least -183 deg.C is required. However, Franz found all the ways to create low temperatures at that time, and -120 deg.C was the limit. This gap is a bit big compared to -183, so he can only give up temporarily. However, a huge bounty was still offered for this. Nadler, a little known doctor, created the earliest device that could separate nitrogen. However, it was impossible to do this, based on the understanding of people at the time. In fact, Franz also had misunderstandings about the method of nitrogen separation. After all, he only knew some parameters, and then he took it for granted that this was the only way. The high pressure gas compressor manufactured by Nadler easily exceeded the number that previous people thought was impossible to break through, reaching 250 atm. Normal pressure. Just when everyone thought it was incredible, this person created an ultra-high pressure of 3 gas compressor. This record was not broken until the end of the 19th century, but he failed to separate nitrogen from the air, so the Vienna scientific community proposed the concept of eternal gas. They believed that part of the air would never be liquefied. Franz knew they were wrong, but he couldn't find a way to refute it for a while. However, he paid a large sum of money to acquire Dr. Nuttall's invention for continued research within the Royal Society of Sciences on how to separate nitrogen. Franz's behavior is still an act of charity in the eyes of others. After all, the ultra-high power compressor does not seem to have any obvious value point. However, it greatly promotes the research on the power of chemistry and physics, and can also resurrect a unique military unit of the Austrian Empire. In fact, Franz's investment in science and technology seemed more like charity or entertainment sponsorship in the eyes of the nobles at the time. But Franz did not choose to sponsor artists, but craftsmen, scholars, and scientists. In fact, at first some people were dismissive of the awards and positions established by Franz, showing the ancient style of starving to death without eating the food they brought. After all, those who engage in experimental science are usually rich people. But when they knew the specific amount of the bonus, they all became eager to get it, and even wished that the Grand Duke would look at them more. However, Franz rarely appeared in public, and even if he did appear, he would be followed by a large number of guards, so it was unrealistic to directly find the Grand Duke himself. But Franz would not refuse scientific progress. Although he could not see the new inventions one by one, the Royal Society of Science was here, and now there were two major journals, Nature and Science, plus irregular campus seminars and community-wide invention bounties. The talented people in the Austrian Empire will not feel aggrieved that their talents are not recognized. After all, no one except Franz himself can cover the sky with one hand, so these people do not have to fear being banned for offending authority. Franz will try to treat every inventor and patentee fairly, but the specific rewards must still be calculated based on previous commitments and the possible future impact on the Austrian Empire. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 574 Franz's Pastime. Nitrogen is almost an inexhaustible resource on this earth. Mixing hydrogen gas can produce nitrogen fertilizer. By then, the Austrian Empire will be able to support a much larger population than it currently has. As for Dr. Nuttler, since he had a talent for construction machinery, Franz suggested that the former become an engineer instead. Naturally, the other party readily accepted the offer, and thus there was another big shot in Austria's construction machinery field. Franz doesn't want to limit the other party's research direction. If he wants to continue to improve the compressor, he can. If he doesn't want to, then he will disclose the research results and let others continue to study. Mr. Babbage, who converted to the church, also encountered a bottleneck, which was the operating speed of the steam engine. The upper limit was too low, and even a perfect design could not achieve true perfection. So the pioneer of computers began to study Archduke Franz's new power, electricity. Babbage collected a large amount of research information on electricity, and then began another sprint in a new field. Babbage directly skipped all the previous steps to prepare for the development of an arc generator. Of course, this was just Franz's own feeling. After all, his understanding of electricity was very limited, otherwise he would have gone to work on the generator himself. Franz tried asking other electrical experts to interpret Babbage's ideas, but others thought he was crazy. Ada on the other side, Babbage's assistant, the daughter of Lord Byron, is still perfecting the previous Trinity analytical engine. This analysis machine has been able to achieve many leap-forward calculations, but the problem is also obvious, that is, it is too huge and runs slowly, and there is a certain probability of self-destruction. After Babbage went to study generators, the younger Babbage took over the former's mantle and continued to preside over the research of the Trinity analytical engine. However, the latter prefers small and delicate things to the former. He feels that, as long as he can solve the problems of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, it is enough. After all, it is better to let mathematicians and calculators do the problems that are too complicated. In fact, after Franz developed the profession of calculator, a large number of laboratories and institutions began to hire calculators, and for a time, the demand for this profession exceeded the supply. In fact, the most ironic thing is that Babbage's analytical engine was never able to defeat those top mathematicians when performing complex calculations. In addition, the development of steel-making technology was smooth sailing. The alkaline converter steel-making method used by the Austrian Empire at this time could well avoid the problem of high phosphorus content in the Austrian Empire's iron ore point. As for the top-bottom blowing method, it was actually invented by Austrians, so Franz's use of it now is not considered plagiarism. Plattner and Bacher showed great interest in gas liquefaction experiments, but what they wanted was not nitrogen, but oxygen, because in this way they could achieve the kind of pure oxygen blowing that Franz said key method. In fact, although the top-bottom blowing method used at this time is advanced, 79% of the air contains useless impurities. This is undoubtedly a huge waste. If it can be replaced with pure oxygen, then no matter in terms of output, quality, or speed can be improved. In fact, their prediction was correct. Even today, the top-bottom combined oxygen converter method is one of the most advanced steel making methods, and it does not have as many restrictions as the electric arc furnace steel making method. Once this method is realized, the quality of steel will be completely inferior to this era, and the speed will be more than 10 times that of the open hearth method. Visiting new inventions and discussing new technologies should be Franz's biggest pastime at this time. Someone has developed a new technology for refining mercury. This thing is of little use to the Austrian Empire itself, but fortunately, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany has the largest mercury mine in Central Europe. Franz was able to sell the technology to Grand Duke Leopold II of Tuscany, who readily accepted the deal, since they all belonged to the same family. Archduke Leopold II had little interest in ruling the country and rarely interfered in national affairs. This time he accepted the deal because of family ties, but this is also his advantage, because he is more concerned about family affairs. Archduke Leopold II was also one of the early people to invest in Franz. In return, the Austrian Empire now became Tuscany's largest customer of mercury. Mercury has a wide range of uses, including but not limited to the production of chlorine and caustic soda, acetic acid, acetone, etc. Mercury compounds can be used to make antifungal agents for leather and plants, wood preservatives, and anti-corrosive paint for underwater parts of ships. Mercury is also needed for military use. Produces pigments for use in paintings, cosmetics, printing, etc. It is also a traditional medicine. It is not a legend that European doctors cured all kinds of diseases by bleeding and injecting mercury. Bloodletting and mercury therapy were once two prominent therapies in the European medical community. Patients either died of blood loss and infection, or were poisoned by mercury and their blood was replaced by mercury. However, mercury is not useless in medicine. It has certain effects in treating disinfection, diuresis, stomach diseases, skin diseases, and sexually transmitted diseases. In addition to these, mercury can also be used to make various dosimeters, such as barometers, thermometers, sphygmomanometers, etc. Its two main functions at this time are actually producing chlorine and extracting gold. Although mercury is almost no longer used in the production of chlorine in modern industries, there was an extreme lack of electricity at that time. When electrolysis could not be used, the traditional mercury method was the best way. Historically, the gold rush in California was extremely wasteful. What the gold diggers took away were only large pieces of gold sand. The gold particles and pyrite dispersed in the quartz were thrown away as garbage. Among the old chemical wastes were even more. There are a lot of gold particles remaining. If Franz hadn't mastered the mining rights of minerals, he would have opened a recycling factory to buy the waste residue left by the gold diggers after refining gold, as well as ores that were considered unrefinable. Don't underestimate this humble recycling work. Turning waste into treasure is no joke. Judging from the level of waste at that time, those gold diggers might not have recovered as much gold as Franz. In fact, Americans can still find the waste that was abandoned by the gold diggers back then, which shows the amount of waste at that time. However, the method of extracting gold from pyrite using mercury was only proposed in 1851, but this did not prevent Franz from using it at all. The approximate process is to first react mercury and pyrite, remove the arsenide after roasting, then add chlorine gas to pass through the ore, then add hydrochloric acid and pass through hydrogen sulfide to precipitate the gold, while the iron molecules remain in the solution. With the emergence of new discoveries and new laws one after another, the iteration speed of physics and chemistry books used for teaching is also accelerating. Franz had to hire someone to edit the new chemistry/physics application manual to keep up with the times. After all, this kind of high intensity and fast-paced work is neither decent nor realistic for people to use love to generate electricity. But this is for experts and scholars. For students in basic education and secondary education, those basic common sense will not change, so there is no need to worry. Chapter 575 The Last Christmas. In 1845, there were 8.5 million Irish people on the island of Ireland. 5 years after the famine, there were less than 6.5 million people left. After that, the population continued to decline, reaching a bottom of nearly 5 million. Countless hungry people on Emerald Island are looking for all the food they can eat, and even grassroots and tree bark have disappeared wherever they go. At the same time, almost every week, grain ships loaded with cattle, sheep, and wheat set off from the island of Ireland to the United Kingdom, and countless ships came from the United States to the island of Great Britain. But at this time, the British government will dispatch 2/3 of its troops on the island of Ireland to escort these life-saving food to prevent any hungry people from approaching. The Irish were only allowed into the docks when the grain ships were leaving. A large number of hungry people even fought against their compatriots in order to board the slave ships. Even so, they might be thrown into the sea by the slave traders. After all, their choices were so many that there was no need to pity them at all. The men and women who boarded the ship didn't care where they were going, as long as they could leave Ireland, their homeland, and the land that gave birth to and raised them. December 25, 1844, Christmas. The Jennings family spent a rare and happy Christmas, because just now Father Hans and Father Cloven knocked on their door and sent blessings, and also sent a grilled fish and a bottle of wine, as well as some beans and dried vegetables. However, the two priests did not stay too long and went to the next house with gifts, but this did not hinder their family's good mood. After all, even if there was no grilled fish and wine, they still had potatoes and privately brewed whiskey. At this time, the Irish were not qualified to privately brew wine, and wine must be taxed, otherwise it would be illegal, so they did not return gifts to the priests, because they did not want people to get into unnecessary trouble. Now that there are so many extra ingredients, the little ones are no longer sleepy and clamor for delicious food. The parents didn't want to spoil their children's interest, so they allowed them to eat. The Janus family is considered one of the relatively wealthy Irish people on Emerald Island, but their family does not have enough to eat every day. Luxurious days like this are rare, so the man took his wife's hand and danced the dance they had danced when they were young. The brisk dance steps made them feel like they were back in their youth. The man picked up his wife and walked towards their room. Scathach Jennings poured red wine to his younger siblings while their parents weren't paying attention. A group of children smashed the bottle and quickly destroyed a bottle of red wine. They did not feel the effects of the alcohol. So at the instigation of his younger brothers and sisters, Scathach poured the bottle of whiskey to everyone again. Patrick had just attended the regular meeting of Young Ireland, and it was a time when his blood was boiling. Even the wind and snow could not suppress the blood in his heart. However, as soon as he opened the door, he saw a mess of cups and plates. Scathach and her brothers and sisters were giggling under the bed. Their old dog was almost squeezed to death by several children and was screaming non-stop. "What's going on with you? Are you possessed?" Patrick was a little angry and confused as he tried to pull a few people out from under the bed. As a result, every time he pulled one out, another one would crawl under the bed with a smile. At this time, his parents heard the noise and rushed back. "Patrick, what are you doing?" the father yelled angrily, because this eldest son is the most careless guy. He only knows how to go to drinking parties with a group of idle guys all day long. Do you really think he is the same as the French? They have wine and meat at their banquets, they have carriages when they go out, and they carry guns. And what about that so-called Young Ireland? It's said to be a cocktail party, but you can't even afford a bottle of wine, and you still want to fight against Britain and save the country. The mother on the side felt more sorry for her son, half kneeling beside Patrick to help him catch some little troublemakers. "Wine? How can you let them drink? At this time, the mother finally realized that something was wrong. There was a strong smell of alcohol coming from the few little ghosts, which could explain their abnormal behavior. I didn't. Patrick argued. However, due to stereotypes, his parents felt that it was him who had done something good, so a meal of fried meat with a leather belt was inevitable. Scathach, who was holding an empty wine bottle next to him, burped and fell asleep. In fact, the entire Queen village and even Southern Ireland are enjoying themselves because of Franz's so-called sending warmth operation. Although these foods were nothing to Franz and the church, they were as warm as the sun-shining winter to the overly poor Irish people. At this time, most Irish people had an annual income of less than £3. Compared with them, Silesian weavers were considered a wealthy class. Almost no one owned their own land, and most people's property did not exceed £30, while a horse pulling a cart during the same period cost £35. But this may be the last good Christmas they have before the famine ends. Almost at the same time, a rare blizzard came to Western Europe. Spain and France were the hardest hit areas, and farmers suffered heavy losses, but these did not attract the attention of the government and financiers, who were still celebrating one great victory after another. The coalition forces of Morocco and Algeria were completely vulnerable to the French army, and the new mini-bombs and dense fortresses were the nemesis of the nomads. The Sultan of Morocco, Abdelrahman, repeatedly sent people to sue France for peace, and the Algerian rebels also split within themselves. The day when France would fully occupy Northwest Africa seemed to be coming soon. The French discovered a large amount of resources in the newly acquired North American colonies. These fertile and flat lands were very easy to develop, and the development costs could be recovered in just 10 years. Louis Philippe named the newly acquired land Arizona and New Mexico, New Louisiana, seemingly to distinguish it from the old French colony of Louisiana. But France's top leaders know that a new France will definitely appear on the North American continent in the future. The titular Queen of Spain, Isabel II, was not yet a heavy tank of later generations, but a young girl longing for love. She completely inherited the beauty of her mother, Queen Regent Christiana, and the character of her father, the irascible King Fernando VI. Although Isabel II has not yet ascended the throne, she often claims that she will execute all rebels and restores tradition. This is actually the influence of Sister Pathini, Father Claret and his group. This group of conservatives instills so-called orthodox thinking in the Queen all day long, and makes her believe that the divine right of kings is actually destiny. In fact, Isabel II and Carlos were both puppets of Spanish conservative forces. Both of them believed in religion, and were miserably cheated by religious groups guided by ultra-conservative ideas. Isabel II not only did not pity the people who were affected by the disaster, but also felt that it was a divine punishment that they must accept, or even oppose any form of assistance. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.